Good morning and happy Monday, everyone. We've got the chat section live over here. I'm typing a question. I want to know how your weekend was and did you ponder what we've discussed in the past sessions? Because today is a big day. Today is the kickoff of the work for the 58th Oklahoma legislature. And we are going to have quite a few bills going through the process. It's going to be a very interesting today with discussing some of the issues that we've got in store, and we're going to kick off with a wonderful conversation about what is probably the most important issue that the legislature discusses, the budget. Their sole task that's spelled out in several sections of the law spells out that they are in charge of passing a budget. And it's going to be a fun conversation with Greg Sawyer this morning. Lacey, looks like we've got about 3 minutes until we officially kick off business. So would you go ahead and play our final video for the week?
Gonna have a three-ring circus someday. People will say it's a fine one, son. Gonna have a three-ring circus someday. People will come from miles around. Lions, tigers, acrobats, and jugglers and clowns galore. Tightrope walkers, pony riders, elephants, and so much more. Guess I got the idea right here at school. Felt like a fool when they called my name, talking about the government and how it's arranged, divided in three like a circus. Ring one, executive. Two is legislative, that's Congress. Ring three, judiciary. See, it's kinda like my circus. Step right up and visit ring number one. The show's just begun, meet the president. I am here to see that the laws get done. The ringmaster of the government. On with the show! Hurry, hurry, hurry to ring number two. See what they do in the Congress. Passing laws and juggling bills. Oh, it's quite a thrill in the Congress. Focus your attention on ring number three. The judiciary's in the spotlight. The courts take the laws and they tame the crimes, balancing the wrongs with your rights. No one part can be more powerful than any other is. Each controls the other, you see, and that's what we call checks and balances. Well, everybody's act is part of the show, and no one's job is more important. The audience is kinda like the country, you know, keeping an eye on their performance. Ring one, executive. Two is legislative, that's Congress. Ring three, judiciary. See, it's kinda like my circus. My circus. I'm gonna have a three-ring circus someday. People will say it's a fine one, son. But until I get it, I'll do my thing. With government, it's got three rings.
And for the record, it was Schoolhouse Rock that called our branches of government a circus, not me. So we will just leave it at that. But the circus begins today for Oklahoma government, and it's going to be an interesting show of what we're going to have in store for us. For those that have seen, we've had a record number of bill filings in modern history, and as far as I know, our entire history of our state. And there is going to be a lot of conversation on policy. What happens behind the scenes that is equally, if not more important, is the discussion of the funding of the different agencies and branches of government. And we need to be aware of that. It can't be a conversation that just begins in April, right before the committees fully start meeting in public. It's something that needs to happen from day one. With us today, we have one of my oldest friends, one of the most brilliant individuals I know when it comes to understanding how the budget process works in Oklahoma, one of my former bosses at the state capitol, Mr. Greg Sawyer. And Greg is joining us from his phone. He was having some technical issues. So Greg, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to start the conversation. And let's see, we're not hearing you, so you may be muted. There we go. That? Perfect.
Better? Okay, good.
Yep.
Good. Well, again, let me start over. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really do enjoy having these conversations with people about the budget process. I certainly feel that it is something that the public generally doesn't know much about, but the process is very hard and intimidating at times to learn anyway. And I appreciate, I apologize first of all for my physical condition here. I'm still recovering from some surgeries. I had to remove some skin cancer here, so I'm a little self-conscious about my hair and my face at the moment, but we'll move on here. So a couple of basic things to talk about in terms of the appropriations and the budget process. In Oklahoma uses those annual appropriations. That means appropriations are written for every year. There are a few states that will do appropriations in a biennial basis. They'll write appropriations for 2 years. The second year, they may come in and make some adjustments for the any changes through the course of the year. I apologize. If we could move to the, if I could move. I don't know if I'm able to move to the next page there, Joe. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, so just covered the first item there about the annual appropriations. Again, Oklahoma makes appropriations on an annual basis. Some states, some you may be familiar with, Texas is one that is a typical biennial state, and they make adjustments on the second year. Oklahoma has toyed with the idea of biennial appropriations, but nothing has ever come of it in the past. The Oklahoma fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. Ooh, there's a big typo there. Which means that for the 2021 legislature, they're going to be writing appropriations for what's called FY22. So that would be for the upcoming fiscal year that starts on July 1st. Oklahoma is required to have a balanced budget under the state constitution. State collects roughly $13 billion in revenues from all sources, and only a portion of that is subject to appropriations. So you see the kind of comparison there for FY21. $13 billion was collected on the state, and only $7.83 billion was appropriated. The difference being that some of the revenues are earmarked for specific purposes outside of appropriations, and some of the revenues go to, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but some of the revenues go directly to counties and cities as well. So the Oklahoma generally does not appropriate to the cities and counties. Now we're going to kind of get into some of the weeds here. Again, as I mentioned, the appropriations process and the budget process can be very intimidating. This is kind of where it starts. You'll hear people talk about appropriations. By and large, the general revenue fund is the sole source of most of the appropriations made to state agencies. There are 11 appropriated funds overall. The remaining funds are generally, even though they're subject to appropriations, they're generally only authorized for a specific purpose or to specific agencies. So you'll see some discussion about a particular fund to a particular agency that is appropriated, but by and large, most agencies get general revenue fund. There are some funds that in Oklahoma are not subject to appropriations, that is federal funds. And then there are, and this is the key point, if you're going to work in the budget process, there is other agency-specific generated funds that are generally referred to as 200 funds or revolving funds. That has, in recent history, taken on quite an important element in the appropriations process because the legislature has, from time to time, gone in and taken funds from those 200 funds to appropriate to other agencies. So you'll hear some conversation about that while you're out there. The key to that is a lot of these funds are generated from fees and licenses and things that individual agencies do. But the legislature has some, as I mentioned, some oversight here, simply because they've gone in and pulled cash from those funds, if you will, to supplement appropriations that they've made on an annual basis. So I don't know how you want to proceed, Joe, if you wanted to just take questions at the end or as we go interrupt here, but the next, however you'd like to proceed.
Let's take questions at the end, because I know
Okay.
there are some of the things like this, I know especially people need to understand.
Okay, so the key to appropriations is two things. One, the appropriations are made from an estimate of funds and also available cash that the state has accrued. This is very important because there are a few states that do not make official estimates of funds. And Oklahoma, up until 1941, I believe, only appropriated cash you had on hand. Then they started making some estimates and tried to appropriate those estimates. That didn't really work out very well. And in 1941, the change to a different process. So the State Board of Equalization has a number of functions, but with regard to appropriations, it is the body that makes the estimate for what the legislature can appropriate. The legislature can appropriate 95% of what's called the certified estimate of certified funds. The certified funds refers back to the 11 appropriated funds I mentioned in the previous slide. So the Board of Equalization will say, we will come in, we estimate, for example, $100 coming in on income tax for the upcoming fiscal year. Under the provision, the legislature can appropriate 95% of that estimate. So in our example, the legislature could appropriate 95% of the income tax, $95 of the income tax. That's a control that was put in 1985 after the budget problems from the early 80s. There was a number of things that had been done at that point to stabilize the budget situation. We'll refer to another one here in a little bit. But the board has at least three meetings that are connected to appropriations in the process. In December, the board sets the initial estimate for the revenues and the appropriations authority for the upcoming fiscal year. That meeting has been met. That meeting, I believe, was December 18th. There is a second meeting in February that basically does the same thing. It updates the December estimate. That meeting has not happened yet. That generally happens the second week of February after the January collections come in. The December and the February meetings can look at economic conditions. They can look at what they believe the state's going to accrue in terms of they generally work off a moving average, but also they take in consideration what they think the economy is going to do. If there's going to be a downturn in the economy, if there's going to be an upturn in the economy, they can make the estimate based on all kinds of factors they feel are relevant. The next meetings, when the Board of Equalization meets, is only in response to legislative changes to revenues. So that meeting typically comes after the end of session, but before the beginning of the fiscal year. And it comes in and says, for example, if the legislature changes a tax rate on income tax, they can only certify a new estimate based on that change. They cannot go back and look at any economic conditions at that point. Sometimes that meeting, actually that process has been divided into several meetings. I remember one year, when we're out there, every time the legislature changed the revenue, they had a Board of Equalization meeting for that particular revenue. But I think generally in recent years, they've tried to do that all at one time. So only be one meeting after session. So again, the key factors there is the Board of Equalization is the one that makes the estimate. The legislature can appropriate 95% of that certified estimate. The first two meetings in December and February are based on economic conditions and what people think that the economy is going to do through the course of the upcoming fiscal year. The last meeting is only to certify changes in revenue adjustments that the legislature has adopted in that session. So you can see there in the bottom of that one slide there, the FY22 Appropriations Authority, that's the 95% number as some people refer to it, is $8.464 billion. And that is $631 million or 8.1% above what was actually appropriated for FY21. Now, another factor that comes into play here in the February certification, the Board of Equalization also has responsibility to monitor what's going on in the current fiscal year. If they see some problems or they see issues positively or negatively, to be more exact, they will make a change in the FY21 estimate in this case, and then the legislature can operate accordingly. The Board of Equalization only provides estimates for the upcoming fiscal year. The legislature is free to appropriate any cash that is accrued that is sitting on the accounting books. Cash is outside the Board of Equalization process. So if you hear a conversation about accessing what's called cash flow reserve fund or cash in general revenue fund cash, that money has not been looked at by the Board of Equalization. That comes between an agreement between the legislative leadership, the governor, if they want to access that cash. I did it again. So Joe mentioned at the beginning of the introduction here that this is an important process. It appears that the process only starts in April before the legislature starts to wind down. It begins much sooner than that. It begins basically when agency requests are due to the governor and the legislature on October 1st. The agencies spend, it varies by agency, but some agencies spend September working on their budget estimates. When I worked at corrections, we started our process the day after the legislature ended for the previous session. So there is some work that goes on through the interim, through the summer, through the early fall by various agencies and trying to develop what they believe they need for the upcoming budget year. This is an important process. I always try to encourage people that they have some particular interest or an agency of interest. They strive to get involved at this point. That way they know what the agency is asking for. They know why the agency is asking for it. You could have some influence, you may not have some influence, but it definitely gives you education and information to carry in your back pocket when you go to talk to your legislators. From October to December, generally the activity is involved with internal hearings by the executive and the legislative staff. That basically means the executive staff at OMES, governor staff, legislative fiscal staffs, they're talking with the agencies about their budget requests. You know, they've gotten the request in hand, so they're calling them and asking them to talk about what's in their request. They also do some questions about how things are going this fiscal year, or what about things that the legislature wanted you to do last year, or how's those going. So basically an update and getting basic information in order to appropriate and to meet with their leaders to talk with them about what the agency's requests are. As we mentioned there in December, there's the first Board of Equalization meeting. That tells us roughly how much money to expect for the upcoming fiscal year. Although if you're a good legislative and executive staffer, you already know that number before it's presented. The February board meeting is also listed there, but that comes after what you're going to hear later today, which will be the governor's presentation of his budget to the legislature. Typically that comes very shortly after the state of address is made. I mean, in terms of physical presentation, there will be a book handed out to legislators, and that'll go through a lot of details. But the governor typically puts his priorities in the state of the state in terms of the budget. February through May collapsed a lot of activity in that time frame. That's when the legislative deliberations are going on. That's when the leadership is working on the final budget, trying to figure out what they want to do in terms of the agencies, what they want to do in terms of revenue, and what they want to do in terms of even appropriation strategy to get the appropriations bills done and to the governor. Last year was, I guess, kind of an interesting year in recent memory, where the legislature leadership and the governor had an impasse, and even got to the point where they weren't able to work it out until the governor vetoed the budget and the legislature overrode it. So that's kind of that usually doesn't happen in recent, at least not in recent years. Joe may correct me on that, but in May and June, that's when the legislative budget starts to come together. The work through the committees, the work through the leadership, the work through the governor's office. The budget will be adopted, and then the governor can do what he feels is appropriate in terms of his priorities, and if he's going to accept or deny pieces of the budget or the budget entirety in the case of last year. And then lastly, the last Board of Equalization meeting, if it's needed, if there's been some legislative changes to the revenues, that meeting will occur, and then that will be the end of the formal part of the process for the fiscal year. And then it starts all over. So in terms of the legislative process, each chamber has an appropriations committee, which is broken up by a number of subcommittees that are aligned by subject. For example, education has Common Ed, Higher Ed, Career Tech, and some smaller education agencies in it. They have purview over those lists of the agencies. They have responsibility to look at what those agencies are requesting. They have responsibility to look into what those agencies have been doing for the current fiscal year. And basically, trying to be comprehensive here, but they do whatever is asked of the leadership to do in regard to that particular agency or that list of agencies in their subcommittee. A key point here, which I think, needless to say, I've got a personal bias on this, but I think it's a very key element here. Each subcommittee has an assigned staff. And if you are working in the Capitol trying to figure out some things on the budgets, these staff are key elements because they know a lot. They know a lot of what's going on, not just in the subcommittee, but also overall. So they are very good contacts, very good information they can possess in their heads. I always try to recommend that you try to get to know the staff person so that if you have questions, you have concerns, that you can talk with them as well. If you have been out at the Capitol for any length of time, you probably have run across the fact that lots of subcommittee members don't really have the depth of knowledge of what's going on currently in the process as the staff do. Unfortunately, sometimes the situation in the appropriations process is it gets very leadership intensive, and your day in and day out subcommittee member may not have a good understanding or even a grasp of where things are headed. A staff person can help you with information on that regard, so you can help decide where you want to go next in your efforts. Subcommittees, and even the Appropriations Committee, are sometimes assigned substantive legislation just like a regular committee. So you'll see some of that while you're out there. Appropriation bills, this is part of the strategy I alluded to a minute ago about during the deliberation process in the legislature. Part of the strategy is to determine which types of appropriation bills to use. In recent memory, general appropriation bill, I think, has been the dominant one. I can't think of a year, really, Joe, correct me, if there has not been a general appropriation bill in quite some time. The general appropriation bill has some unique characteristics. It is provided for in the state constitution. It is also provided for that you can get an emergency vote on the general appropriation bill with only 51 votes. So that makes it extremely handy in the legislative process to get that through with a minimal amount of difficulty. I want to say prior to maybe early 90s, the appropriations process was generally done through individual bills for each agency. Those bills had an emergency clause on them, which had to have 3/4 vote in order to get the emergency done. The key to the emergency really on these things is to have the appropriation, get the appropriation bill to take effect prior to the fiscal year starting. Otherwise, the appropriation bill, if it had no emergency, would not take effect until November timeframe. So the general appropriation bill was used early on in statehood. It kind of lost favor through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It became a very good tool to use again in, like I said, starting in the early 90s. That bill, as you might imagine, is very cumbersome in and of itself. It is not unusual to have a general appropriation bill of 100 pages or more, which makes it difficult for some members to support because they want to be able to see it, they want to be able to read it, they want to be able to digest it. And that's not always time in the early days of the end of session. The reconciliation bills are what would be considered the individual agency bills that used to be the majority of the process years and years ago. That's typically where you will find any adjustments to appropriations from the general appropriation bill. And you may find some instructions and things of that nature in there about how to spend the money. For example, sometimes you'll see line items in those bills. Sometimes you'll see legislative intent on this is how we want this to happen, and kind of those sub-business things in the details that you can't really put in the general appropriation bill. So you'll see in the appropriations process, you may have to track 1 or 2 bills, and maybe more than that, depending on the agency. The general appropriation bill, which has the basics of what the funding is going to be for the upcoming year, and the reconciliation bill for details on any specific instruction or line items. After the process is completed in the legislature, the bill goes to the governor. The governor can treat the bills just like the regular bills in terms of an overall veto of the bill, but he also has a a line item veto on the appropriation bills, which he does not have in substantive bills. Lots of states have this. There is, to me, it's a very intriguing aspect here because what constitutes a line item varies state by state. It is usually resolved by the courts, but the governor can go in, he can affect the budget by line item vetoing. Now in Oklahoma, he can't make his own budget after he line item vetoes it. He can't put a number in. For some states, the governor can change the 10 to a 9, but that doesn't happen here. All he can do is take away. Like I mentioned, the other aspects of the vetoes are the same for appropriation bills as they are substantive bills. So you see there on the slide, he has the various 5 and 15 days and the veto override provision, just like any other bill. So a couple of things here that I try to recommend to people as they work into the budget process. Again, I know it's an intimidating process. It could be a very frustrating process. Negotiations. That is a key thing because negotiations happen at some level every day. Some leadership negotiations even start before the Board of Equalization meets. If you have an interest in one of the top 10 agencies, I would encourage you to get started on that in the fall. Lots of times, I mean, I've experienced this in my career. Lots of times, some of the top 10 agencies' appropriations have already been agreed to before the legislature even starts. It's just a matter of some of the details and maybe tweaking the money here and there, but by and large, they know what they want to do. The leadership being they know what they want to do in an agency before the legislature starts. So it's key to get in on the early part of those processes, key to get into that information stream so that you know what's going on and you could hopefully get your interest known to the parties that be. A key element here to remember for the process is under the Constitution, revenue raising measures start in the House. There's been some question as to what constitutes a revenue raising in recent years. So there is an element there of gamesmanship, I would say, between the House and the Senate as to what is a revenue raising bill. But technically in the Constitution, a tax increase bill for sure would certainly start in the House. Now, I mentioned earlier about the use of cash and one-time funds. This has become a big issue in the last 20 years for sure. Again, cash is not part of the certified estimate process. It is cash that's sitting in the books. Typically in a year where you see the revenue estimates are above 95% or even 100%, there's cash sitting on the books that the legislature has accessed. The problem with that is that could very easily be one-time funds, and one-time funds oftentimes get used for continuing items, and that creates a budget issue. You never know if that cash is going to be there year in and year out. You don't know how much cash is going to be needed to be replaced at any given time. So it becomes a game trying to figure out how much cash you can use, how much can you put for one time, and how much can you put for ongoing expenses. You'll see some conversation, I'm sure, this year as well, that even though the funds are 8% above what they were last year, there's probably a certain amount of one-time money in there that needs to be replaced. So the question is how to make that switch happen. So ongoing expenses are funded with ongoing money. This kind of factor amazes a lot of people. Generally speaking, the top 10 biggest agencies get 90% of the appropriations in the process. That goes back to the point I was making earlier, that if it's a top 10 agency, the decision on how to appropriate that, or at least the basic level of appropriations, sometimes gets made by leadership before the session even starts. So then you're down to messing with the details, trying to get X amount of dollars for this program versus Y amount of dollars for that program within the agency. So it's important, if you want to work in this area, important to get started on your influencing and your knowledge process as early as you can in the fall prior to session. I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that there are legislative issues in the House and Senate with the leadership's handling of the appropriations process versus the openness of the process with the run-of-the-mill member. I don't have really an opinion on that, except to acknowledge that it does happen. It is a situation that frustrates lots of members. And if you're going to work with members on the appropriations process, you need to understand that that is there. And as sort of as I mentioned to the relationship to the staff, if you're going to work in appropriations, you need to develop a diverse element of information and avenues of where you can get information you need, and also get information back to the other side. So unfortunately, you may run into a situation where a subcommittee member wide doesn't really understand what's going on. That's not because of the members' lack of interest. That is just sometimes the feature of the process and how the decisions are being made, and how the leadership is more involved in some things than they are in others. So just keep that in mind as you're getting out there and working the room, so to speak. So again, just hopefully this has not been too tedious. I know it's a lot of deep weeds here, but if you need some resources to kind of get into the weeds, the Board of Equalization documents are on the OEMES website. You can pull them up, you can look at them there. They are kind of intimidating if you're not accounting oriented. But if you spend a little bit of time with them, read the headings, read the notes, you can get a good sense of what they're trying to do. The documents generally have all kinds of tables that show some historical information. They'll compare this year to last year, the prior year. They'll compare the appropriations authority estimated for the coming year to the prior year to the current year. So lots of information there on the revenues and the appropriations authority. The House of Representatives, I know this was going on before I worked there, but they have I believe is still a pretty outstanding document that goes in and talks about each agency's appropriation for the current year. It goes in and explains why this funding has changed, why that funding has changed. It goes in and describes some of the legislative instructions. It goes in and describes some of the particular emphases that the legislature has had. It also provides you some historical charts and some pie charts, so you know how much the appropriations to an agency, how much is general revenue, how much is cash, those kind of things. I would encourage you to definitely, if you have an interest in a particular agency, or that you go take a look at that. It is a very outstanding document. It is a very comprehensive document. And as far as I realize, I've not found one from OES, but it is maybe the only document that still summarizes appropriations in any level of detail. I don't believe there's one by OMES, and I think the Senate does one, but I don't believe it's near as detailed as the House one. And then I find, if you don't have it already, I found that the Oklahoma Electric Cooperatives app for the legislative guide, I found that to be a pretty handy tool to find out who's where. And it's got some information in there about the different members, their districts, and certainly has a picture if you don't know who the member is. So I found that to be pretty handy to have in my back pocket. So at that, if we have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know that's a lot, but again, the process is a lot. So,
Greg, thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and hope the healing process is going well for you.
Well, it's been going well so far. So we're on the downhill side. So
excellent. And we'll have people, if they would like, type questions in over here in the chat section, and Greg will be here to answer them. I want to go ahead and kick over to our next speaker. I know she has a very busy day as they're trying to get documents distributed to the lawmakers to make sure that no boo-boos are made on their part as they're going through the process. Lawmakers have to follow the law and the rules as well. Very pleased to have my good friend Ashley Kemp on here to discuss the Ethics Commission, ethics rules and laws that are followed by the lawmakers, and then tips for advocates. So Ashley, I want to kick it over to you. Greg, thank you again for sticking around.
sure. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Okay. So I have a lot to cover, but it's really going to be just an overview of the ethics rules for, with an emphasis on lobbyists, just lobbying generally, and then a little bit on campaign finance. So let's see, how do I advance slides on here? Okay,
if you'll just let me know when you want them to go, I'll forward them for you.
Sounds great. Okay, so the Ethics Commission really is a constitutional entity created by the citizens of Oklahoma. And it is specifically tasked with writing civil laws called ethics rules for the conduct of state officers to employees and campaigns for elective state office, as well as initiative and referenda. Those rules are not Administrative Procedure Act rules, but rather they are rules that are the equivalent of statutes. They're published in the statutes. They're just called rules to distinguish them from legislatively enacted law. So you can advance the slide. So during this pandemic, we tried to move a lot of what we do online. We've typically been very heavily invested in providing resources to our regulated community. Anyway, because for those of you that don't know, the Ethics Commission has 6 staff. So typically in the past, we've had up to 7. Right now we have 6, but we are responsible for right now 817 candidate committees. We have 576 lobbyists registered who represent probably around 1,100 or more lobbyist principals. And that doesn't include some of the other campaigns that we deal with, which are the political subdivision level. So we really have tried to create a website that's very user-friendly and resources that answer common scenarios that arise so that anybody can go and find answers to most of the questions they're going to have. And we've really tried to make them entity specific and update our website so each entity has its own page. So this is a picture of our new homepage, Advance. And for lobbying in particular, this is the lobbyist webpage. So we have on there the reporting calendars that apply to the different types of lobbyists that we're going to talk about, a guide for lobbying, and then our fees and compliance section, everybody's least favorite section, and then links directly to the Guardian system so you can view reports or file reports, and when we have them, educational programs. Unfortunately, as Mr. Sawyer was talking about earlier about revolving funds, and you'll hear a lot about those, a change in the Commission's revolving fund statute a couple of years ago actually has meant the Commission had to cease our routine educational programs and just do them as we're able to fit them in right now. Advance. So the ethics on the website, you'll see here's the guide for lobbyists. It will be updated probably here in the next couple of weeks. We needed to make some changes. But on the website, you're going to find all of the ethics laws for the state of Oklahoma. You'll find an annotated version, which talks about the history of the rule and some common examples and scenarios on how the rules apply, kind of what the Commission's policy is behind that particular rule. And then a compilation, which is all of the ethics laws that we have identified in the state of Oklahoma, whether or not they're enforced by the Ethics Commission. You'll have lots of resources. So this guide, we also have checklists and various other resources available for you. And you can review the Ethics Commission meetings and the agendas and minutes. So really, really interesting reading. So the ethics rules exist primarily with regards to state officers and employees to avoid conflicts between their public duties and private economic interests. So what we want to do is identify where those interests overlap. We can go ahead and advance. And the ethics rules tries to target that area of overlap with regards to interactions with state officers and employees, and even to a certain extent with regards to candidates. Advance. So let's talk a little bit about lobbying and meals and gifts from those lobbyists. Advance. So we got three types of lobbyists: legislative lobbyists, legislative liaisons, and executive lobbyists. So legislative lobbyists are independent lobbyists that, well, I guess I'll follow the slide. An individual who represents any third party for compensation and communicates with state officers and employees to influence state policy or state action. So a lobbyist is somebody that is not a state officer or employee, even though they may represent a state agency. And if they are compensated to influence anything, any kind of state action whatsoever, they probably need to register as a lobbyist in the state of Oklahoma. A lot of times people think it's just really related to the lawmaking process, what goes on here at the Capitol, and the passage or defeat of certain House bills or Senate bills, legislation, but it goes beyond that, and it includes things like executive orders or agency rulemaking, or really any program, policy, or position of state government. So a state officer or employee whose duties in fact include legislative lobbying is called a legislative liaison. The ethics rules require every agency to have at least one, although they may have a contract lobbyist instead. We have a couple of exceptions to that, which is where the agency only provides information upon the request of the governor or the legislature, or the only pending legislation involving that agency is an appropriation request. So meals and gifts from lobbyists and lobbyist principals, everything is prohibited unless the ethics rules specifically permit it. And so let's talk about what some of those exceptions are. So we categorize meals and gifts according to two categories. So we have meals and gifts from a lobbyist or liaison to a state officer or employee. And those are more individualized gifts, kind of a better to think of one-on-one or a lobbyist or small group events, or a gift from a lobbyist principal, which is the client of the lobbyist or the liaison. So generally, the meals, we can go ahead and advance. The meals and gifts from lobbyists, which we'll talk about first. Overall, there is a total threshold for gifts of $500. And so that all of that $500 may be spent on meals. That's a per calendar year aggregate total. $100 of the $500 may be for what I call a major life event. So marriage, adoption, or birth of a child, retirement, which does not include term limits, but retirement maybe of a state officer employee, or a major illness. $10 may be, we call them trinket gifts. They can be given by anybody one time per calendar year. Those are not reported. So those are the things like the calendars or the stress balls or the things that lobbyists and liaisons may drop off in a legislator's office or a state officer's office. And then we have a modest item given occasionally, other than as part of the meal. So if a state officer employee attends a meeting that's being sponsored by either a lobbyist or a lobbyist principal, and there are drinks provided, soft drinks, water, maybe small snacks, those state officers employees can feel comfortable accepting those refreshments that are being offered as long as they're just offered occasionally and don't qualify as a meal. So lobbyists may also give gifts to family members of state officers and employees, but it's a much more restrictive provision. And so the family member has to actually be a part of the major life event. So in the case of somebody getting married, the family member would need to actually be one of the people getting married in order to qualify. We can go ahead and advance on that one. So the major life events rule, it's a gift that's significant to the recipient. So not from the person giving the item, but to the recipient themselves. Major life events are not annual gifts, so birthday gifts are not going to qualify, or anniversary gifts. They have to be given contemporaneously with the occasion for which they are given, or at other times when those gifts are traditionally given. So baby showers, wedding showers. Otherwise, the lobbyist has to actually be physically present at the meal or the event with the recipient. So I want to talk about that one just a second. So the commission worked really hard in drafting these rules and trying to identify what is the goal of lobbying. And yes, it involves relationship building and it involves advocacy. And the commission, while recognizing there are relationships that are built that may lead to just recognition of major life events, that generally gifts are being provided or items are being provided to further that lobbying relationship and to further lobbying itself. And it's really difficult for a person to lobby a state officer or employee if they aren't physically with them. So it's not activity then that furthers the lobbying relationship if a lobbyist is just providing, for example, tickets to a concert or to a sporting event, but not actually attending with the state officer or employee. So there is a presence requirement that's built into the rules. So lobbyist principals can provide a different types of gifts. So there is one kind that is specific, or I guess two now, we'll get to the second one in a minute, that are specific to state officers and employees, and that's a plaque, a trophy, or a similar item suitable for display. It has to be provided in acknowledgement of public service. There's a $200 value max. It can be provided one time to a state officer or employee one time per year by that lobbyist principal. And other than that individual gift, which is reported and does have a threshold amount applied to it, then we have what we call the group events. So we can go ahead and advance. And those group events are reported as a lump sum, and only the food and beverage that is provided is reported. So when I say group events, what am I talking about? This is legislative specific. So it's going to be an event to which all members of the legislature are invited. It may be a caucus event. So, and that when we say caucus, we mean an officially recognized political caucus of the House or Senate. So the House Republican or Democratic caucuses or the Senate Republican or Democratic caucuses are the only ones that are recognized within this exception to the gift prohibition. Then we have an exception for committees and subcommittees, and that applies only to those members and the staff that's assigned to that committee. And that's the one event that has to take place within the Capitol building itself. And then the slide cuts off, but there is another exception for out-of-state conferences for those events which may be hosted that are specific only to Oklahoma state officers or employees. And a minimum of 5 state officers or employees must actually be in attendance for that out-of-state exception to apply. When that exception doesn't apply on those group events, they're just reported like any other individual gift being provided by the lobbyist. And I can see some questions coming up, and I'll get to those. I'll want to run through the slides as quickly as I can. Meals and gifts from lobbyists and lobbyist principals. This is something that occurs that lobbyists need to be aware of and employees of the lobbyist principal need to be aware of. A lobbyist and an employee of the lobbyist principal who wants to take a state officer employee out to lunch or out to dinner, and they're going to put that on their company credit card. It's not a meal being provided on a personal level, but company funds are being used. That all of a sudden becomes a gift that has to be provided by a lobbyist. And so you just need to be careful, because that is something we see occur that can catch those executives really specifically of a lobbyist principal off guard. And so they really just need to take their lobbyist with them to those particular meals. And so that's just something to be aware of. So then there's a new type of gift the commission actually passed this year. We can go ahead and advance the slide. And it is Amendment 2021-02. It's going to apply to lobbyists, liaisons, and lobbyist principals, so everybody that can provide gifts. And under the proposal, it will allow a state officer employee to receive an item such as a book or similar informational material, so long as it relates to their duties as a state officer or employee, even when given by the lobbyist or lobbyist principal. It absolutely in no way affects lobbying by letter, email, flyer, anything that was done lawfully in 2020, 2019, since 2015 is not affected by this rule change, because it's providing a new category of gift. Now, the commission did go ahead and they approved the rule. Well, I'm delivering it to the legislature today along with some other things. But the commission went ahead and directed me to enforce the rule as though it's in effect as of January 1. So this is a category of gift that can go ahead if it's provided and it exceeds $100 in value. It just needs to be reported like any other gift. And it won't be enforced as though it's a violation of the gift laws in this state. So when reporting it, because it's something that's fairly new, the Guardian system, which is where all lobbyists report their gifts, we don't have a category in the drop-down box right now for that to be chosen. So if somebody gives that, they'll use the gifts to state officer employees option, and in the free form text box, they'll just type in books or similar informational material and then explain what it is. If it's not clear from the title, if it's, for example, if it's a book, how it relates to that state officer employee's position, you may just want to add a couple of word description so it's clear to anybody looking at the reports. What's important about this rule change is there is not an aggregate limit. This does not count towards the $500 overall gift limit. Does not count towards it. So any item can be provided as often as anybody wants to give them and as often as a state officer employee wants to receive them. But if the singular item exceeds $100, it will be reported and show up on an ethics report. So I'm going to talk on vendors just real quick. I don't think it's something people think about very often, but if you are lobbying a state officer employee or interacting with a state officer employee, the ethics rules consider a vendor as somebody very general, a seller or prospective seller of property or service to the state. So that includes things like utilities, which is often overlooked. And we distinguish on what can be given based upon where the agency is during the contracting process. So during the purchasing process, when the bid is out or bids are being submitted or considered, there is a no cup of coffee rule. A vendor or a vendor's agent can give nothing to a state officer or employee that's involved, not even a cup of coffee. Once the contract is awarded, there are certain things that can be provided. I'm not going to get into that. Just know that there are some things that can be provided, and that is in the state officers and employees guide that's available on the Ethics Commission website. So let's go ahead and advance. And we can advance to the next one. I just covered that one. So Cupcake Thursdays. This modest items of food and refreshment apply to vendor gift rules as well. And it has to be a modest item of food or refreshment, a soft drink. Alcohol is not considered in modest items of food or refreshment under the ethics rules. And of course, it includes the things you would expect to see maybe at a meeting. But it's something that's given occasionally. And so we were giving this presentation, I won't say where, several years ago, 6, 7 years ago, well out of the statute of limitations. And a question arose about Cupcake Thursdays that were being provided by a vendor to that particular state entity. And so it gave us just a second and we moved past it. But just so you know, Cupcake Thursdays would be something that's considered more than occasional under the ethics rules. So we went ahead and put a provision in the ethics rules for waivers. So if there's a relationship, the ethics rules try to take a common sense approach. It may not sound like it, but we do try to take a common sense approach to relationships. And the fact that Oklahoma is really a small community overall, and that there are instances that arise where a state officer or employee, maybe a family member and related to a lobbyist or a vendor or a vendor's agent to the state, or a friendship may have existed between somebody that's restricted under the ethics rules or people that are restricted under the ethics rules that existed before their state service began. So college roommates is a great example, or lifelong friends, any of these. And if that situation applies to a state officer employee, they can request a waiver from the commission. It's just a form that's submitted. It's prospective only. The commission will consider it at a commission meeting and review the facts and make a finding on whether or not it appears the granting of the waiver will in any way hinder the ethics rules or the spirit intent of the ethics laws of the state of Oklahoma. Family members do not need to apply for the waiver. It's considered automatically granted if the recipient and the giver are related. So the rules also take into account private business activities. I'm not going to go into that, but we recognize that legislators, for the most part, Oklahoma has a part-time legislature. And so we do and have worked in some exceptions and some rules that are specific to those part-time or those private business activities. Political activities, I did want to cover these. When I talked to Joe, he had said maybe there would be some interest in the campaign finance rules and how they apply. So just very quickly, just like on, I showed you earlier, the website, we have a page that's specific to candidates that are running for elective state office. We have a guide that's specific to those state candidates. It's meant to be used electronically. It lays out the ethics laws for campaigns in plain English, and then has an actual hyperlinked rule citation. And if you click on that rule citation, it will take you to the annotated rule. So you can actually see the rule language itself, and also additional scenarios and guidance that's been provided by the commission. So here's that web page that's specific to candidates. So it's a little more information than what's on the lobbyist page, because a state campaign is a little more complicated than the lobbyist gift rules in the state of Oklahoma. So we have reporting calendars, the candidate guide, the laws, a contribution chart on who can give what under the ethics rules. We have checklists that you'll want to review and follow before starting a campaign for elective state office. Or if you already have a campaign or know somebody that does, how to transition from one committee to a new committee within the ethics rules. And we've spent the time as staff to go through all the issues that we have seen and address them. So you'll also see here a link for financial disclosure. Elected state officers and employees follow financial disclosure rules in the state of Oklahoma and have to file those. Candidate committees. If somebody is running for office, we can go ahead and probably advance 2 slides. Candidate committees in this state are required to register anytime they spend or receive in excess of $1,000 in contributions or expenditures. And that includes, and this is important, that includes the candidate's own money. So if a candidate is spending their own money and they exceed $1,000, they have triggered a reporting requirement with the Ethics Commission, and they need to file a statement of organization within 10 calendar days and pay the $100 registration fee. Now, for brand new candidates, a common misconception is until you file that declaration of candidacy, that you do not have a candidate committee. And that is not accurate. And that is a common misconception we saw as we started working through the new rules put in place in 2015. And so we just want to make it very clear that a candidate committee can be formed anytime, at any time for an election or previous to an election, and they're formed specifically for an election. So they are an election specific, which means if you run for election more than one time, the 2018 elections, the 2020, 2022, each of those would require a separate and distinct candidate committee. And so again, those checklists I talked about a minute ago do allow for transitioning between those. You just have to do it the right way. And we have laid out exactly how to do that. So the contributions, overall, the ethics rule scheme for campaigns is we track every dollar going in, and you need to track every dollar going out, and you'll report them in the Guardian system once you meet the registration requirement. And you need to keep a record of everything that is related to your campaign to substantiate the reports that are filed with the commission. And so monetary contributions, that's what most people think about when they think of a campaign contribution, but it also includes things that are provided, like goods or services, or even a discount off a good or a service would be considered a contribution under the ethics rules. All of those contributions are aggregated together. So there's not one limit for monetary and one limit for in-kind. They're all aggregated together. And once you have received those contributions, you get to spend them for various things, but primarily for ordinary and necessary campaign expenses. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. And that's an expense that would not exist but for the campaign. And then we have, once a person is elected, those office holder expenses. And those are expenses that are incurred in connection with their duties as a holder of elective state office. Now, I'm going to go through this next slide. I have some others, but I think this will be a good place to stop. So generally, state officers and employees must refrain from using public resources, and that includes personnel, funds, property, or time for political purposes. One of the questions we get most frequently, and it's usually from legislators, if a state officer or employee is using their state email to advocate for or against legislation, is that a misuse of state resources? The answer to that is no, because the restriction is on advocacy for or against a candidate for elective office or a state question, and advocating for or against legislation does not meet that criteria. What is important to know is that if a state email is being used or state phones are being used for that purpose, or any state resources to advocate for or against legislation, that person may accidentally have become a legislative liaison that needs to register and start filing reports for the state of Oklahoma. So just be aware that there are some things to be wary of and just aware of, really. And we talk about that in a staff memorandum that's available on the ethics website. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Actually, I'll add one more thing. We have an overall exception for emergency services. If an emergency hits the state of Oklahoma, tornadoes, for example, and there are vendors and there are lobbyist principals and they are out providing food and drinks to state officers, to anybody that's helping in the relief efforts for that particular major disaster, a state officer or employee can absolutely accept that without being concerned with it being reported, and a lobbyist or a lobbyist principal can provide it without concern if it's meeting a gift limit or needs to be aggregated with something. That is a flat out exception to all the gift laws, as long as it's being provided to anybody that's providing those relief services. So I will stop there. I could see some questions coming across. Joe, I know you're on a time limit and I've run over, so I'm happy to take questions. I'm also happy for those to be emailed and I can send them to Joe to distribute the answers. So it's just whatever you want to do.
Go ahead and take these 3 questions. Jerry is next and she's on, and she said go ahead and take a couple of minutes to answer these. And we can't thank you enough, and especially I'm really glad to see that our calendars should be included in that book portion. So now I can raise the price of my calendars.
Go for it. Okay. Okay, so from Claudia, we have I need a tutorial on the Guardian system. Okay, so the Guardian system is only for those state elections, really, and that's what it's designed for. The commission has actually requested money routinely for the last few years to get money to put political subdivision reporting online in the Guardian system, because the Ethics Commission is responsible for enforcing it. However, if you are involved with political subdivision campaigns, you know that all of those reports are filed locally. Well, the Ethics Commission doesn't have access to those. So we've requested funding for the political subdivision division that exists within the commission itself, but which is currently unfunded, and also for IT support so we can bring that online. But with regards to filing, we have compliance officers that will be more than happy to make an appointment with anybody that wants a tutorial on the Guardian system, and will take you through how to use it at any time. We have a PowerPoint ready to go, and that's what our compliance officers are there to do, which is to assist filers on how to use the Guardian system and actually how to report anything under it. If food and beverage are donated by participating members, are these items reportable as same? Excellent question. So I'm going to take that as, are you asking if a board of directors, for example, for an organization, and they provide a gift to somebody, is that reportable as being made from the lobbyist principal itself? And that's the slide I talked about, where if the lobbyist principal's funds are being used to provide the item, then yes, it's reportable, and you just need to make sure your lobbyist is with you so they're aware of it and can report it in accordance with the rules. If it's just a personal item being provided by a board member of the association or group, and the association or group itself is not a lobbyist principal, then no, it would not be reportable. Books. May I, as a constituent, not a lobbyist, gift legislators with books about education that will help them understand some issues in public ed? I've been told they cannot accept books. So we became aware of an issue under the rules because it's a blanket prohibition that if a book was valued at less than $10, it could be given under the $10 trinket gift. If it could be given some way, if somebody was having a major life event, it could be gifted as long as it didn't exceed $100. But let's say it's a $20 book and there isn't a major life event and it's clearly related to a state officer employee's job, the ethics rules would have prevented that from being gifted under the rules as they were in place in 2020. We have a different rule for vendors, which allow for those materials to be provided it relates to the state officer employee's responsibilities. So the commission actually revised the lobbyist rules December 31, New Year's Eve, and a couple of lively public hearings on December 11th and December 31 about that, and the commission adopted that proposal to the rules and went ahead and directed me through a vote to enforce that rule as though it's in effect as of January 1. So as of January 1, books may be provided and will be enforced as though that rule is already in effect. It just needs to relate to the state officer or employee's job responsibilities. And if it exceeds $100, then it would be reported like any other gift. How has the growing state breweries and vineyards changed ethics rules regarding lobbying? Which are the typical mistakes well-meaning vintners, brewers make when approaching legislators? Oh, that's such a good question, and one that's actually near and dear to my heart. My family used to have a vineyard up in Northwest Oklahoma. I think it's more of a general lobbyist beginner mistake, not necessarily specific to breweries and vineyards, but if you have hired somebody to advocate on behalf of your brewery or your vineyard or your organization, period, whether it's here at the Capitol or maybe it's at the state agency that's providing the regulations, they need to be registered in the Guardian system and they need to be filing routine reports on those expenditures. And typical mistakes, one is not reporting on time. We really want you to report on time. You need to introduce yourself. Your lobbyist needs to introduce themselves whenever they meet with a state officer employee and tell them who they're representing. So I'm the liaison for the Ethics Commission. So when I meet with a legislator, I say, I'm Ashley Kemp, I'm here from the Ethics Commission, and I want to talk to you about whatever it is I want to talk to them about. A lot of them already know me, but the rules require me to say it, so I say it. And even if it's not said, a state officer employee can ask at any time who you represent, what you're there for, and if you're registered as a lobbyist in the state of Oklahoma. And you're required under the ethics rules to tell them. So other potential rule violations are recognizing that other than meals, for the most part, other than meals and this new books and similar informational materials provision, really Oklahoma is operating as a no cup of coffee rule, as a no cup of coffee state, unless there's something that's being provided for a major life event. But when it comes to food and beverage, those can be provided as we discussed earlier. But I think that's maybe one of the common mistakes, is thinking that you can provide anything under the sun as long as it doesn't exceed those gift limits. But it really has to fit within those categories, because we have a blanket prohibition against anything being provided unless specifically allowed in the state or in the ethics rules. I am not seeing any more questions, but I'm hoping that answered everybody's questions. But if not, I would guide you to the website, the Ethics Commission website, and to review that guide, which really has a lot of those common scenarios that we're presented with at the Ethics Commission, and maybe you all would be presented with when you're going around the first time. We really are the experts. We are a small staff and it's getting smaller by the year, it feels like, which means it takes us longer to respond to you. So if you have a question, call us early rather than when you're up against the deadline. And 90% of the questions you have are answered in the guides and in the checklist that we have available on the website. So check there first. And if you still have a question, then call, and that helps us be responding to those really specific questions that aren't already answered in the resources more quickly.
And I just want to add on, there are some things in life where it's acceptable to do this, but always, always when it comes to these questions, ask permission instead of asking forgiveness with the Ethics Commission.
Well, as I can't grant you permission. But remember, I am not a priest. I cannot absolve you. I mean, I can't do that. So if you talk to me, just be aware, anything you talk to me about is not going to be confidential. It's not a confessional. And I am charged with representing the commission, but we do want you to be in compliance with the ethics laws of the state, because it's better for the state as a whole. And so anytime you have a question that isn't answered in the resources online, please feel free to call me, or you can just walk in the door if you're here at the Capitol. If I'm here, and I will be here Monday through Thursday right now, I will sit down with you at any time. There are very few times when I am completely unavailable to have a meeting.
Ashley, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
service. And thank you for all the work you do out there, and be safe today.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you again. And next, we want to move into our next conversation. We have one of my long-term friends who we would have qualified certainly under that exemption. We've known each other for a very long time. You obviously are far younger than I am, but my Democratic leader when I served in the House of Representatives, and my Lieutenant Governor, who I got to help work on her campaign, someone who has been a tremendous child advocate. As Lieutenant Governor, Governor Askins asked myself and Jay Paul Gum, who's also on this call, to carry a children's cabinet bill, which was forward thinking because a lot of states are looking at that right now. Governor Askins, I couldn't think of anybody more qualified to talk about the other two rings of the circus in the three-ring circus of government, as you have extensive knowledge, background, serving and working in the judicial branch and the executive branch. And so I want to turn it over to you just to let you visit with advocates, and we'll open it up to questions after you're done, if that's all right.
That'd be great. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
All right, thanks. I told Joe I'd really like questions and answers because that way I know exactly what's on your mind as it relates to the executive branch and the judicial branch. Looking at the agenda that you all have had last week and today, this is such a good foundation for people that may not have yet spent much time lobbying particular issues in front of the legislature. And I can promise you, having Ashley and the Ethics Commission talk is a good reminder for those who have already experienced advocacy at the Capitol, because you never know when there have been small changes, and you want to know what you're looking at before you step in something and do something unintentional. If you look in the Constitution, one of the things that I've been in this particular job as the administrative director of the court for, let's see, I lost everybody. For a little over 5 years now. And I got my start, if you will, in public service as a judge. So as the administrative director of the courts, it's kind of brought me full circle. And of course, I've had a couple or three different stints in the executive branch, 2 or 3 different times as a director of a state agency, working for different governors, and then certainly while lieutenant governor. And one of the things I noticed when I came back to this particular position was not inaccurate, but it was really an intentional change in language by many members of the legislature in not referring to the judicial branch of government. Although in civics, we all learn about the 3 branches of government. In the Oklahoma Constitution, they are referred to as departments. So if you look up Article 6 in the Oklahoma Constitution, you will see the executive department. And if you look up Article 7 in the Oklahoma Constitution, you will see the judicial department. Statewide elected officials in the executive department have grown fewer in number over the last few, several decades. Probably when I learned who all the statewide elected officials were when I went to Girl State, there were probably 14 or 15 of them. You have the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the treasurer, the state superintendent of public instruction, state auditor and inspector, insurance commissioner, and labor commissioner. Secretary of State is now appointed by the governor. The commissioner of mines is appointed by the governor. The commissioner of charities and corrections, which used to be elected, Kate Bernard was one of the first ones, is now the DOC director and the DHS director, so they're appointed. And then the commissioners of the land office are statewide elected officials plus the Secretary of Ag. And then you have also elected 3 corporation commissioners, and the Corporation Commission is statutory. It was created after the original Constitution. So we have about 11 statewide elected officials right now. As you all know, and it's been interesting to watch over the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, historically, Oklahoma's been referred to as a weak governor system, with a lot of the power of the executive branch spread throughout the hundreds of agencies, boards, and commissions that are appointed mostly by the governor. Many require Senate confirmation, and a lot of them have appointees from the Speaker of the House as well as from the President Pro Tem of the Senate. And for decades, for 100 years or more, most of those agencies, boards, and commissions had the authority to hire or fire their own executive director. But over the last 8 to 10 years, we have seen slowly the legislature begin to move toward eliminating that authority of the agency board of directors, if you would, the board members, and giving that hiring authority to the governor. So it has, it's been interesting over some of the policy issues that have come up in the last couple of years, specifically that the authority the governor has to name the director of an agency and the policies that come from that, versus the legislature being slightly more involved and more involved in policy decisions than they are right now. If you jump to the judicial branch, I would tell you we have 26 appellate judges in the state of Oklahoma. We have 9 members of the Oklahoma Supreme Court. We have 5 members of the Court of Criminal Appeals, and we have 12 members of the Court of Civil Appeals. We have 6 civil appeals judges who sit in Tulsa and 6 who sit in Oklahoma City. We have 241 trial court judges. We have 75 district judges who in Oklahoma and Tulsa County will run for election in the whole county, but in eastern and western Oklahoma, their jurisdiction will cover several counties. There are counties in far west and northwest Oklahoma where the district judge may have 4 or 5 counties that he or she is responsible for. And those are counties where he also stands for election. We have 77 associate district judges, 1 for each county. Those were created when we had court reform in the late 60s by state question, by a vote of the people. And then we have appointed judges, 89 special judges who are appointed by district judges upon authorization by the Supreme Court and funded by the legislature, depends on where they go, based on caseload. So those 241 judges are, the districts and associates are elected just like state representatives, just like officials at the courthouse are elected. Their election will be a year from now, a year and a half from now, in 2022 is the next cycle for judicial elections. It's been kind of interesting the last couple of years while I've been in this job, because a number of state questions have been appealed or a writ's been filed with the Supreme Court or asking for original jurisdiction to determine whether or not a state question is constitutional, or whether or not the ballot title meets the requirements of law before it can be placed before the voters. There have been some pretty major questions, and sometimes when those state questions are passed by the legislature, a legislative referendum, the Supreme Court doesn't have a lot of time to be able to look at them before ballots are needed. So they may just have a couple of months through the summer to be able to look at that issue. Signatures, when it's initiative petition and signatures are gained around the state, sometimes those come in earlier, and that once they're certified by the Secretary of State, then the Supreme Court often looks at those to determine the same thing, whether the title, the explanation meets the requirements of law. But we have had in the last year a number of lawsuits, if you would, filed by the Speaker and Pro Tem, Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the State Senate against the governor. And those are issues that come before the Oklahoma Supreme Court. If they're that high of a level, that's a case that the Oklahoma Supreme Court will retain and will talk about. Now, I know that in about 15 or 16 minutes, you're going to hear about tribal relations within the state. So I want to be sure and give plenty of time for Chief Hoskins and Chief Wood to be able to visit with you. So the only other thing I would say is a lot of people don't understand or don't know that the Supreme Court of Oklahoma has what we call superintending power over all of the courts in the state. So we have meetings a lot with different groups of judges to be able to ask opinions, see how things are going. We created a task force on this pandemic to advise and give best practices as to what's working with virtual, what works in Stevens County may not work in Cleveland County, and what Tulsa County is doing may not work in Woodward County. So we have an opportunity to share different thoughts about what's going on, and that's a lot of what my specific job entails. Not a lot of people go back and forth between executive and judicial branch. I know at least 2 other people I served with or that served in the Oklahoma legislature that ended up either in the federal executive branch or the federal judiciary. Former Oklahoma State Representative and Oklahoma Attorney General Robert Henry ended up being a federal judge on the 10th Circuit, and former State Senator Vicki Miles LaGrange ended up being a U.S. attorney, which would be in the federal executive branch, and then ended up being a federal judge here in the Western District of Oklahoma. And so she met the judicial branch as well. But for me, having started as a judge and then having been a legislator and then elected lieutenant governor, all of those experiences really have worked together to help, I think, make me better at the job I have right now, because I work very closely with members of the legislature on bills that pertain to how the courts will function, how they will carry on their procedures and what is needed there. And then I work with the executive branch, with the governor's office, on issues that could be in front of the court on the judiciary, which is a disciplinary body, or with the Judicial Nominating Commission, as there are vacancies to be filled by the governor until there's an election cycle. So having some experience in all of those departments has been very helpful to me. So Joe, I told Joe that I just came back from the eye doctor and my eyes are still kind of dilated. So I'm not sure that I can read the questions if they've put them in chat, but if you could share any questions of the participants, I'd be happy to try to address them.
Absolutely. First question is it possible for Governor Stitt to appoint a person as a cabinet secretary and also the head of an agency, or would that be the same as overseeing yourself?
Yes, and it has happened over the years quite a bit. And the best example I can give you is that most often the governor has the ability to appoint the Commissioner of Public Safety, who is the head of the Highway Patrol and the Department of Public Safety. And ever since I've been around, the person who was the Commissioner of DPS was also the Cabinet Secretary for Safety and Security. So that's a long time example. My first experience when I was up here would have been when I worked in the governor's office, and Governor Walters did that, Governor Keating did that, Governor Henry did that, Governor Fallon did that. So that's my example for that.
And I'll take it one step further. You can also look to Sandy Garrett as an elected official serving on the cabinet as a Secretary of Education.
Correct. Governor Bellman started that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Governor Walters continued it. And then I think Governor Keating and Governor Henry moved away and appointed someone else. But yes, elected officials could be.
And right now we do have that in an instance with Justin Brown being the head of DHS and also being a cabinet secretary.
Correct. Not elected, but appointed.
Correct. The next question. So are we now in line more with how most other states exercise their power? I noticed Stitt said that the executive branch in other states and the federal government control most agencies.
Well, I don't know about all 50 states, but Oklahoma, as the 46th state in the union, there were specific reasons why our Constitution in the early 1900s kind of spread the power out among the people, if you would, among elected officials, even as it relates to legislative leadership having appointments on some of these boards and commissions. Definitely with the federal government, that is certainly what we hear a lot at the Capitol, of wanting to make a lot of changes to where we would mirror what goes on at the federal level. But there, I think you're beginning to see some pause by members of the legislature now who are concerned that, whereas not control, but input, that they used to be able to have a little bit more with directors of agencies coming in front of appropriations and being able to talk to those agency heads openly and transparently. I think they're beginning to pause to make sure that they don't go to the other extreme. If Oklahoma was a very weak governor, do they want to go all the way to the other side? And so I think some of the changes, like we saw 5 agencies, I think last session or the year before, that were specifically changed, it may slow down.
What do you see coming forward this year? Over the last, we'll say 3 cycles, we've seen a tremendous number of new lawmakers coming in. And I know one of the things that we've seen, we both have experienced being freshman lawmakers, we both have been experienced as senior lawmakers. How can advocates do a better job of reaching out to those individuals at the legislature and in some cases the state agencies and be a resource for those people passing the laws and then those in the agencies administering the policies?
Well, first of all, I would tell you, when you are running for office, you act like you're an expert on everything, and then you get elected and you find out you know absolutely nothing about the things you talked about during your election. Now, you may not go back and say that to your constituents, but when you get up here and you start finding out, well, I had this great idea that, you know, we were going to change XYZ, and all of a sudden you find out there's constitutional prohibitions or obstacles or other statutory obstacles that you can't get to what you had campaigned on in a direct line. At least you may have to find other ways. But here's something I learned, and an example I will give you about brand new legislators. And even though I've been around the legislature some as director of the parole board and deputy counsel in the governor's office before I was elected state representative, the year I was elected state representative, Jim Halligan became president of Oklahoma State University. And guess what? He didn't know any of the 101 state representatives. Well, he probably knew the one from Stillwater. And so I made it a point to get to know him, because if he didn't know anybody, then he wasn't going to know who was new and who had been here 5-year terms or 10 years or what. And so I would tell you, if you have an advantage with brand new legislators, because they don't know very many people. I mean, they're still learning who the people are that sit in the desk around them on the House and Senate floor. So take advantage of that. Don't shy away from new legislators, because you have an opportunity to get to know them perhaps in a way that more senior members may not pay that much attention.
And we have a comment and a question. For the comment is not a question, but wanted to say what an inspiration you are to me. I met you a long time ago and was inspired by your accomplishments and your strength in politics, especially in a red state. That's from Daniela.
Thank you.
There is a question from Carolyn McAllister. In your opinion, when you have governor-centric state government, does it decrease the ability in a pandemic? In your opinion, when you have, in your opinion, we have governor-centric state government decrease ability to be responsive to people's needs in a pandemic?
You know, the pandemic is a little bit different kind of emergency, but I would tell you, even without a pandemic, typically through Oklahoma has its fair share of catastrophic emergencies, whether in the first year that I was lieutenant governor, we had some extremely severe ice storms that wiped out from Oklahoma City up the turnpike to Tulsa. Devastating. We've had horrible life-taking tornadoes that we know about. And our emergency management department, our groups that come together as a task force, as a coalition during those kinds of emergencies are really, many of them are the same coalitions that have been involved in trying to implement the plans of the state health department and the governor during this pandemic. So I think that a lot of our boots on the ground, if you would, are people that have been long time in agencies and departments, like the National Guard. I mean, their logistics is a very significant part of their training, and they've been a very important player in the delivery system, and even early on in testing as the teams went to different nursing home facilities, et cetera. So I think as long as you have the people who are actually going to implement the changes or the directions, it doesn't really, I mean, it helps, you know, a lot. Everybody always wants one person to blame, but they want a whole lot of people to share the credit. It doesn't really hurt. Governor is always going to be in charge in those kinds of emergencies, but because of funding issues, I do think that there are times that the legislative leadership needs to be involved, because the impact, the collateral impact on appropriations needs to be understood.
Could not agree more. And this one kind of diverges off your topic, but we've asked other panelists this. What's your advice for advocates on how they can be most effective out at the Capitol this session, especially with the pandemic, and making sure their voice is heard?
You know, I just had this thought as you said that, Joe, and I don't know that it's accurate, but maybe if you get the ability to go to the Capitol, maybe you need to make sure your mask is something. If you're going to advocate for kids, maybe your mask needs to be something that's kid oriented, that has children on it, that has something that you can point to and relate to so that they might remember you. I think that you may have an opportunity to meet more legislators on FaceTime. If you call, you may want to ask their assistant if he could, if his or her state representative, state senator, if they do FaceTime. Maybe if you don't want to do a Zoom, maybe you could do a brief phone call, but at least be able to look them in the face and have them kind of see who you are as you are talking to them. So I think you have to be a little bit creative, because we're not sure how much visiting there will actually be in a member's office. But you have to remember, many of their assistants, I mean, that's where everyone sits waiting, and we don't want to put those assistants at risk from a health standpoint, as a number of them were ill late last spring and then through the summer. But get to know the legislator from your area, get to know the legislators who are chairman of committees that you have interest in, children and family, health related, education related, and then make an effort to get to know members who are the authors of the bills. I think those should be your targets, because you can't get to know everybody.
That's true. Here's a good question for you, and part of your role having to go to the Capitol some. Do you have any concerns about bills that have been filed so far this session as they affect or might affect the court, and especially how the courts interact with children and youth?
I didn't hear the last part.
Especially how they might interact with children and youth.
I always have concerns about some of the bills that are filed related to the judiciary. When I came to the legislature, there were a couple of members who, one had already been a special judge in Garfield County before he served about 4 or 6 years in the House. Several who have been in the legislature who later became judges. They've all retired now, but there are very few people. There are people who will maybe have been a police officer, so they've been a witness, or they've been an assistant DA, or they've been a defense counsel. So they come at those issues with that perspective, because that's the shoe they walked in before. I was never any one of those. And so my background was always as a judge, used to listening to both sides and trying to figure out what the best answer was. But what I found is most legislators had no idea how a judge would actually interpret or apply their specific amendment if it passed. And so I consider that my job, to try to go and give those explanations. I can't make them pull a bill. I can't really defeat a bill, but I can give explanation and perhaps help figure a better way to accomplish the goal thereafter.
And
Short answer, yes, I always have concerns about bills.
we should always be concerned, and things could change at the drop of a hat too. Committee amendment.
They did last year.
That's the truth. Who should be an advocate within the judicial system to change the age restriction to all children when a child witness alternatives in a child abuse case?
You know, judges really have a hard time or an inability to, I mean, they can give their opinion, but it's very difficult for judges to actually advocate on certain legislation, because our judges in Oklahoma, thank goodness, are nonpartisan elected officials. So they are really prohibited from getting involved in the partisanship if a bill ends up becoming partisan. But we have a group of judges and advisory council, the Juvenile Judges Oversight Advisory Council, JJOAC, 9 judges. They meet monthly, and I send them copies of legislation a lot. Representative Mark Lawson usually meets with them. I think this was the 3rd year now that he has met with them and talked about bills he has, some of which they may not agree with, but they built a relationship, so they have good discussion. You can always ask me and I can send you to somebody, or the JJOAC is an opportunity to get geographic representation from around the state from judges who are heavily involved in juvenile or child in need cases.
Thank you. And also want to remind people, Rachel Holt is always a good resource over at OICA. And then
Sure.
Annette Jacoby, who's on here, is also over at Oklahoma Commission on Children and Youth. I'm glad she's on there so she can hear me say that. She's been a real blessing with the background that she had at the State Department of Health that she took with her to OCCY. She's been a great partner. And someone has asked if you would be willing to share your email so people could reach out to you.
My work email is, you have to spell Jerry right. You know, it's Jari. But Jerry.Askins, like asking a question, ASKINS, at OSCN, that's Oklahoma State Court Network, OSCN.net. There it is.
And you are getting a nod and a wave hello from one of our former colleagues, former Representative Justin Wood.
Yep, I see him, Chief. I would just like to say thank you for including me. And if any of the advocates happen to be at the Capitol and have any questions and see me in the hallway, please let me know. And I'm happy to try to give you a recommendation on who to go talk to or how to deal with something. I spend most of my next 4 months doing exactly that for members. So I might as well help advocates too.
And you just got a text hello from another one of our former colleagues, former Senator AJ Griffin.
Oh, yep.
Well, Jerry, thank you so much for taking time today and explaining the other branches of government for everyone to understand how they can be better advocates.
Good luck with the next couple of things you have on your agenda.
Thank you, Governor.
Thanks.
And as we transition from a governor, we're going to transition to 2 other leaders of sovereign nations here in Oklahoma. Really, we don't cover enough about how the sovereign nations interact with the state government and with how the negotiations occur to make sure that all the people of the state have an equal voice at the table through their leadership. We are very, very fortunate today to have 2 very good friends who are leaders of their nations, leaders of the people who have that heritage here in Oklahoma, of the 39 nations that we have here in the state. These two are amazing young leaders who have a long, bright future, both in front of them. And it's such a pleasure that we get to work with them through OICA. And it was a great pleasure to work with both of them during my time when I was in state government. I want to turn this over because I know we want to allow a lot of time for this conversation. As he popped on first, I'll introduce the Chief of the Sac and Fox Nation, Chief Justin Wood. And then we have the Chief of the Cherokee Nation, Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. Thank you both for being a part of this conversation today.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. So I want to start off with, if we could have both of you gentlemen, we'll let you go first, Justin, explain how the system of government is set up with the sovereign nations and how state government interacts with them, in particular the governor, and what aspects legislators have with interacting with the sovereign nations.
So to be clear, how it should work or how it does work? Yeah.
Let's go over how it should, and
Right.
then the second question will be how does it work? Because they are very different answers.
Right. So to be completely fair, every sovereign nation in this state has a government that's a little bit different. And that's really the beauty of how our sovereignty works. The Sac and Fox Nation, we have a 5-member business committee that governs our tribe. And then we are overseen by a governing council, which is every tribal member over the age of 18. And so the way that really works itself out is the business committee, including myself, and I chair the business committee as the elected chief of the tribe. We have a government to government relationship with the state of Oklahoma 366 days a year. I think it's important to recognize that under most executive branch leaders in the state, there have been difficulties between the leadership of the 39 sovereigns and the state of Oklahoma. So this is not necessarily as unique as it was as negatively and ugly played out in public with this administration. And so there's always going to be difficulties when you're dealing with sovereign nation to government relationships. This one's just been a little bit more public. But the way it should work is there should always be a seat at the table for both entities to work together, and for both entities to have a voice and to represent the people of those nations. And so I have a unique perspective, having served in the Oklahoma legislature and having watched it unfold. I've worked with tribal leaders. I had Chief Hoskin in my office before when I was a state legislator, and we were on different sides of an issue. But he came in, represented himself and his people very well. And my goal was to represent my constituency in the state of Oklahoma well. So hopefully that played out that way in my office that day. I can't exactly remember how it went, but I still liked Chief after he left my office. So the reality is that there's going to be two sides to everything, and the state of Oklahoma is going to have a side, and the people of the Sac and Fox Nation are going to have a side, and we need to get what's best for both every single time. And my belief has always been that what's best for Indian country is what's best for Oklahoma. And I really believe that if it works for us, it's going to work for everybody. And 9 times out of 10, things we're going to maybe even better than that, maybe 10 times out of 10, when we decide to do things in our tribal reservation area, it's going to greatly benefit the people that live there, regardless of affiliation to a tribal nation.
Chief Hoskin.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I appreciate getting to be a part of this. And Chief, I do remember that meeting. All I remember about it is I was right and you were wrong. The rest of the details are a little fuzzy. No, I appreciate it. He's always courteous as a state representative and willing to engage with tribal nations, and we want every member of the legislature to do that, and the governor. So insofar as Cherokee Nation is concerned, I mean, it's similar to what Chief Wood said. Our setup's a little bit different. We have a legislative branch made up of 17 council members. They're elected to represent geographic districts. 2 of those are elected at large. Cherokee Nation is the largest tribe in the country, and actually most of our citizens live outside of our reservation. About 150,000 people live in Northeast Oklahoma. within the 14 counties of our reservation. The rest live outside, and most of those live in Oklahoma. And so there's a substantial presence of Cherokee Nation citizens throughout the state. We have a judiciary, a judicial branch, and I'm the elected principal chief. Our deputy chief is separately elected, kind of like the state does with the governor and the lieutenant governor. The deputy chief and I, Brian Warner, work very well together. The relationship between this, I think maybe the question was the relationship between the state and the tribes, basically. And I think Chief Wood mentioned it, but there was a great deal of difficulty during this past year surrounding the gaming compact. I would say, though, we've been on a progression in this state, except for that, really an anomaly, I think, to improved relations. And I think the reason for that is because we've figured out working together makes sense for our mutual interest, can meet our mutual interest. The tribes have gained strength economically. We're creating jobs, creating economic opportunity in parts of the state that otherwise might not see it. We're also gaining political strength. And all of that, I think, leads to potential for better relations, and it has. Now with Governor Stitt, the relationship has not been good, but I'm an optimist that it's improving and will improve now that we're beyond the gaming dispute, which was the, you didn't ask me this question, but it was the most senseless dispute that I've ever seen a governor engage in with tribes in the history of this state, to put it mildly.
Well, and I know you have an extra special connection with the governor, as he claims his Cherokee heritage.
He is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and that's true.
And
But I would note that now that we're beyond the compact, I think there's ways we can work together, and we ought to work together. I mean, the leaders of tribes and the governor ought to work together, and we're all committed to doing that, I think.
And to be clear, we definitely we've worked through some of those issues as the Sac and Fox Nation, and as we work towards a tobacco compact with the state, we were able to extend that conversation. So there is some movement within the governor's office to work well with tribes. I don't know that reputation is reparable. I mean, I'm not sure if it can happen. That ship may have sailed, but I do want to make sure it's known that we have worked with him since then. And I know the Cherokee Nation has done the same. And so it's just getting past that point. Image is a hard thing to fix, though.
And we have had occasion to work with the governor's office. So extending our hunting and fishing compact for an additional year was important. In the wake of McGirt, there was an issue that affected the welfare of children across our reservation and the 4 other reservations that are really at issue in that McGirt case that has to do with Indian country criminal jurisdiction, but it also touched upon the jurisdiction of child welfare agencies. And we immediately saw that if we didn't reach some, at least interim agreement with the state, that there could be some real gaps in protecting kids. And the governor's office saw the same thing. And so we very quickly and fairly, it was not a lot of fanfare, reached an agreement that it really is protecting kids. So I think credit all around for that.
absolutely. And I will tell you, as soon as that decision was handed down, that was my first reaction. And the nations immediately worked towards that reconciliation to make sure that the kids were protected. So I want to thank you both and thank all of the leaders of all of the nations for making sure that that continuity remained in place where we could all work together to help the kids out. So when we're talking about compacts, and we touched on the gaming, and of course I've had my dealings of working with compacts in the legislature, and want to at least talk about the gaming compact. I was a legislator in my first term when the first version was passed. It was negotiated by Governor Henry, and it was passed where both sides had to opt out. The reason being, I can't think of any other time in history where we were able to get an agreement between 39 sovereign nations and the state of Oklahoma to agree upon a solution And then it would come back every 15 years where if both sides felt like it needed to be renegotiated, it could be brought forth. And the reason being is with so many players at hand, wanted to make sure that everybody, we thought it was fair at the beginning, still think it's fair. We wanted to make sure that everybody had the opportunity to come back to the table if both sides felt that was going on. That's one compact. We also have the compacts with tobacco, with gas, with other items that are sold on nation lands, with hunting. Could you all touch on how that interaction with state government, how we come into finding some of those solutions? And whichever one of you wants to go first.
Well, I'll just say briefly that they're really they're born initially of conflict or potential conflict. You could go back to the era before the tobacco compacts, and there was a great deal of litigation and really sort of public spats between the tribes and the state over whether the tax could be applied by the tribes and to what extent. Compacts really about resolving those issues in favor of something that's stable and predictable and both sides win. So in the case of tobacco compacts, there's revenue that's realized by the state and the tribes. And the same is true for, there was a motor fuels compact, a very similar issue. So I think that the common thread through all of this is resolving something that might be a fairly intractable legal dispute. The tribes may well feel they could win in the end, but sometimes you look out at the judicial landscape at different times in the history of this country, and you might say as a tribal leader, well, I don't know what our odds are there. But you also look at the expense involved in that sort of litigation, and getting something that's predictable that again can allow the tribe to, in the case of most of the compacts we're talking about, realize some revenue. And from the state's perspective, they want to realize something of interest too, usually revenue. So usually it's born of some conflict.
Right, and Chief Hoskin touched on the importance of that relationship. And I think that what we do with compacts is we were able to look past winning and look at what's best for our people and all Oklahomans. And I know that's something the Cherokee Nation does so well, is they take care of all the Oklahomans within their area. And we try to do the same thing within our jurisdiction, and as we continue to grow our business base, and we want to have the opportunity to serve as many people as possible and make it a really make it beneficial for everybody. And what compacts do is they let you get past, someone having to win and lose. Compacts, there should be no winner, there should be no loser. Now, it's not always the reality. But there really shouldn't be a winner or loser. It should be good for everyone, should be a winner whenever you get done with that situation. And we realize that with our tobacco compact. Yeah, sure, we could probably get more out of it, but the state benefits, we benefit, the retailer benefits, and we're able to do a lot of great things with the money that we have coming in for our people and for the people living within our jurisdiction. The same with the gaming compact.
Now, I know both of you do quite a bit in the community. Through previous roles before you became the leader of your nation, how would you recommend advocates can get involved, especially local advocates within the area of where your nation is? How can advocates get more involved in not only working with the nation, but also being a resource expert for issues that might arise?
I'll take that one first. I like to collaborate. And I think that our best leaders are collaborators, and you see that from the very top of government all the way down to school boards or city councils. Those that collaborate do better. And so those that are willing to work together, you may not be getting the credit, but you work together to get the best things done and impact the most people. And so white, brown, orange, pink, I don't care what your skin color is. If you've got a great idea that you think can benefit our area and benefit the state of Oklahoma, and the Sac and Fox Nation can play a role in that, then I want to be helpful. Now, personally and professionally, my expertise and my experience in the nonprofit sector to the policy sector and government relations to being in the state legislature, I love getting to work on the smallest project to the largest project with our nonprofits that are around us, and getting to sit down with their leaders and talk about what the Sac and Fox Nation can do. And if I can do something for you with the relationships that I have at the state government or the federal government level, or maybe it's something the Sac and Fox Nation has to take care of on their own. But it's something that I bring to the table. With the good Lord's blessed me with opportunities at such a young age to get to have those connections and those relationships, to be able to know the Joe Dormans and the Chief Hoskin of the world, and have those relationships moving forward. So when someone has a need, I can help meet that need. And I think most leaders of our tribes have those types of relationships that they can do. They can really be an advocate for you, no matter what level of government you're trying to work with. And especially with you, with OICA, I mean, the impact that you have on the legislative process with those legislators and those relationships that you have to impact the children of our state, the impact my Sac and Fox kids and our Cherokee kids and our Chickasaw kids, our Potawatomi kids. It's a huge impact because, I mean, we have a lot of kids in this state and they're not all Indian kids, but what's good, I mean, what's good for kids is good for all kids. And so to have those relationships, be able to point them in the right direction, to have those opportunities to make a big difference in people's lives. I mean, that's why Chief Hoskin ran for office, make a big difference in people's lives. He didn't run for fame and glory. He ran to make a big difference in people's lives. And that's what the majority of your leaders have done, at least the ones that I've gotten to know real personally across the tribal nations and the state government.
Well, yeah, Chief Wood hit the nail on the head. It is a great place to collaborate with real experts in the field when you reach out to an Indian nation, because we have increasingly some of the best in the business in some of these issue areas that would be of concern to advocates out there. So I just encourage them to reach out. Certainly if they're within the Cherokee Nation or even outside the Cherokee Nation, they could reach out to my office and learn more, share some ideas. You know, tribes are not, it's not a unlimited well of resources, but we have resources, and often we have the ability to be a lot more flexible, I find, than perhaps the state is. Other governments, I think sometimes we can even move quicker. And there may be some opportunities where we can achieve something for a community that's of interest to your advocates that takes a little resource. Sometimes it's about applying for grants, and we have some expertise there. But on issue advocacy, I think, again, tribes are gaining political strength, and we ought to be using that strength to protect the most vulnerable people in our reservations. And when it comes to state policy, that really means we're protecting all our friends and neighbors. If we're advocating for something that's of importance to OICA, then it's going to help really everybody.
I know we love working with ICWA with the regular meetings, trying to visit with each of the child welfare workers who are charged with each from each of the nations, and gathering and sharing ideas. And so there are a lot of cross collaborative efforts going on, not only between the nations, but also with advocacy groups and the state as a whole. And so I want to thank both of you for that. One question, and this is my own curiosity and something I've never asked and have always been curious about. How easy is it how easy is it to work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior at the national level, and how much interaction do you really have with them compared to state government?
Well, we have a great deal of interaction with them. I mean, it's the primary agency that engages with tribes across the country. It is an agency that is difficult to work with, and it's been difficult to work with for so long that we may just get used to the difficulty. There's some wonderful people that work there, but it is a bureaucracy that's set up, perhaps not intentionally, but it's difficult to navigate. The programs are often underfunded. You get a change in administration. Of course, this is true across agencies. Then you have a new set of political appointees that you have to engage with. And often, and this can be the frustrating part for tribal leaders, and this is true whether it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the agency within which it sets, the Interior Department, or whether it's the state, is sort of educating a new group of people over again about Indian country issues. It could be the same with the Department of Health and Human Services, which is another agency we deal a great deal with. One of the frustrations in Indian country is having to start that over, but it's the nature of our federal government. It's how it's run. And so right now we're undertaking an effort to, well, before he was sworn in, to engage with President-elect Biden's team on his agencies, including the Interior Department, where he's nominated Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who will be an excellent leader, and she's a Native American. And she has been a champion for Native issues in Congress. So the opportunity to have somebody like that lead that agency, I think, fills us with some hope that we will have better interactions with the Interior Department, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, at the local level, we have a really good relationship with the regional level staff. All the men and women that work, though, for BIA are trying their best, but they're trying their best within a system that's been around a long time and is a little cumbersome at times and frustrating at times for those who interact with it.
No, I couldn't agree more. The one of my favorite things to do is get to visit with federal and state employees, right? And so they have a really, really tough job, and that's to have the responsibility they have for the people they have the responsibility for, regardless of whatever agency they're working in. That's a tough job. And I know the local BIA employees here in the area, they've been great to work with. They've been great sending us resources. The committee members that have been around longer than I have developed great relationships with them, with our nation and the BIA. Again, working with the president's transition team was incredibly helpful to get to know who they were, what their priorities were going to be. We were able to ask extremely intimate questions as far as what their plans were going forward, what we could expect, and we received our answers very quickly. Now, that was my first experience doing that with a new president's transition team, and so I don't know if I'll ever do that again, but I had a pleasant experience doing that, and I do know that all the issues that we've had in the past are not new issues. And so if they're able to fix the issues that we have, not just the Sac-and-Fox Nation, but tribal nations across the country, if they can figure those issues out and help streamline a lot of the problems that they've had, as far as it's just extremely cumbersome, which an agency that large, the Interior, is just an extremely cumbersome agency. And the Congresswoman's going to do a good job there. I think she's a great selection for that position. She's been a trailblazer everywhere she's been. And I think there's, if anyone's going to be able to help with the relationship between tribes and the federal government, it should be a Native person. And I think that her understanding of the challenges that we have on reservation and off reservation, whether it be healthcare or climate or whatever it might be, she has some insight to that someone who's not Native wouldn't have. And I think that's important to recognize. And that's why it's crazy it's taken as long as it has to get someone in the cabinet of a Native background, of actually being an enrolled citizen of a tribal nation. I think that's a big thing. And it's not a token choice. She's a solid choice for the job. I liken it to Lisa Billy being chosen originally by Governor Stitt. That was a bold choice. Now, he should have listened to her. And so my hope is that the president listens to the Congresswoman, the new secretary, and listens to her ideas and listens to the voices that she brings to the table. Because if he doesn't do that, then there's no point. And I'm hopeful that it's not just a decision to put someone there because it looks good on paper or it looks good in on the website, but to actually take the wisdom and insight from her and listen to it and apply it to the relationship between the federal government and Indian country.
I couldn't agree more on that. I appreciate that. We're in the middle of a pandemic, as you both are aware, and I know both of your nations have been working to make sure that the people of your nation are taken care of. We hear about the numbers from the state every day, and the numbers from the nations are not included in those numbers that go out with the Department of Health. What are some of the frustrations you've seen and some of the high points of what you would like to talk about as far as how we're dealing with the pandemic?
You know, from my perspective, the most frustrating thing has been as charitable as I can put it, the uneven messaging from the state of Oklahoma and from the federal government on really what ought to be some basic public health messages that the country ought to be hearing. And that includes masks and social distancing and things of that nature, and also modeling that behavior, because all the messaging in the world really doesn't amount to much if the elected leaders of the governments go out and ignore it. And that, if you look across the country, that's there's on both sides of the political aisle, there's been offenders. But in the state, I've been disappointed in the lack of a mask mandate. That's my view, is we needed a mask mandate and would have benefited from one. We had a mask mandate at Cherokee Nation since late May. We've tried to be consistent in our messaging, and that inconsistency from other governments erodes how effective we can be. The high points, though, have been so far the vaccine distribution for us. The quantities have been sufficient so far, and our system for getting the vaccines out has worked well so far, both in our outlying health facilities and in our centralized facility in Tahlequah. The concern I have, though, is whether there would be a gap or a lag in the vaccine distribution. So I feel like our system's working well, but we get our vaccines directly from the Indian Health Service, and if there's a gap there in the supply, then we will feel it, and we'll start to fail in our so far successful effort to vaccinate people. I'm kind of work backwards on the timeline. So vaccines for us worked well. The CARES Act funding was as much about responding to COVID as it is also about recovery. And the state of Oklahoma, we all should stop and think for a moment that it got its CARES Act funding, and then tribes in the state also got CARES Act funding. And I think that that's one of the examples of how Oklahoma can, stand head and shoulders above some of the region. Now, it was money that has been well spent, but I think it's been very impactful the way it's been spent. We have done this, and I know other tribes have done this, is spend the dollars in a way that's helping our people directly, protecting them from the virus, getting food out to them, for example, but also helping the rest of the community. It's just what tribes do. We sent some of our money actually to Oklahoma public schools, because at least in our area, a lot of the smaller schools were struggling with adapting to what seemed like a lot of pressure to have kids back in school. And if you're going to do that, then you have to do it in the safest way possible. So we actually directed some funds to that. So we're very happy about that. Our testing went well, but again, there were times when, and I think the rest of the country faced this too, when there weren't enough tests. And testing was and is still so critical to combating this virus. So I think when we had the test, it went well. When it didn't go so well. We got close, and I'm working back to the spring of 2020, we got close to running out of masks. And it amazed me that in this country, the wealthiest country on the planet, that somehow a mask, which is still the most effective way to keep yourself from getting or spreading COVID, that we would be close to running out. We're actually going to manufacture, Joe, masks here on the Cherokee Nation Reservation, which we think the country ought to buy American when it comes to masks, and what better place to buy than the Cherokee Nation, right? So anyway, I've been pleased so far. I just hope the messaging can get consistent and effective across the board.
That is fantastic news. Chief Wood, what have you experienced?
Well, my only desire is that his mask company doesn't have to last that long. So yeah, I hope it's not thing we need long term, but we have no idea when this thing ends. Now so I want to kind of talk about a few of the things that the chief mentioned. One is that mask mandate, and it's something that we had very early on. We passed an emergency resolution, I think end of March, early April, in which we mandated masks on all of our properties. Where the biggest challenge, I think, was just the messaging that was coming across from both the federal government and the state government, and that included the CDC going back and forth on what they thought was good about masks. And so that messaging was really difficult to work with. And the same messaging with the vaccine. I mean, we at this point we could have vaccinated all of our elders, but with some of the messaging that's going around on social media, and they're afraid of the vaccination. And so we're trying to get across the safety and the actual facts about the vaccination out to all of our tribal members. We've been able to I think we've vaccinated of the elders we've had. I think 90% of the elders chose to be vaccinated, and 10% chose not to be, that live within our jurisdiction, our reservation boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries. And so we were able to vaccinate a high percentage of our elders and at risk and employees that have essential jobs. We were able to get almost everybody chose to be vaccinated, but it was discouraging to hear some of the negative and the untrue statements that were being spread about vaccinations. As far as the CARES Act money goes, I love the ability for us to really be collaborative and donate to public schools. And we were able to do that. We did that with both CARES Act money and with money that we had already assigned to allocated for donations. And so we're able to kind of double up on that and service our public schools that way for PPE. Now, Chief is absolutely correct. At one point, it was almost impossible for us to get any of the PPE we needed. It is extremely difficult. Now we have a warehouse full of it. And so we're able to give those to tribal members that need that, people in the community that need that, and of course our employees here that need that to make sure that we're able to continue our services. The most important thing going forward, number one, is that we're caring for the families who have lost loved ones to the virus, or those that continue to battle the after effects of the virus. And we're starting to see that play out in people's lives. We recently lost a tribal member who had recovered from the virus months before and had been recovering and ended up passing away from complications with her lungs. And so it was 6 months, or I think it was close to 6 months after she had recovered from the actual virus from the original time period to when she passed away. And so we're still seeing that type of impact. We've had entire families that have lost 3-4 people out of their family in the household because of the virus. And so it's hitting close to home. And I think everybody now can probably tell a story about a loved one or a friend who's passed because of this virus. And we need to make sure that we're learning from that and moving forward in such a way that we can support one another as we get into I think is probably, we're probably getting close to the meat of this situation, where if we don't start getting things right now, we're looking at another 1.5 years instead of, if we could have started getting this thing right a year ago, and the messaging had been consistent a year ago, federal and state, we may have been closer to being out of the woods at this point. And so in hindsight, it's 2020, but all we can do now is be the best we can be going forward and encourage others to do the same.
We've got one question that came in to Resilient Payne County is a program within the confines of that county that works to raise awareness on adverse childhood experiences and trauma. They oftentimes will reach out to community partners, and Carolyn McAllister asked if either you or both of you know who would be a good contact in the Iowa tribe to engage in Resilient Payne County. Nope.
One of these days, I'm going to figure out how to use Zoom. I mean, you think 1.5 years, I figure this thing out, but I have actually a tribal member that's in that office, so I'll reach out to her and connect. So if I can get the information for the individual that asked that question, I'll make sure I connect them this week.
Absolutely, and I can be the connector if you need, and you shoot it to me and I can forward it on. I know we're going to kick off the State of the State here soon. We're going to hear from the governor about his priorities, about what he would like to see. It's inevitable some things will come up with tribal relations. They always do. I know the tribal leaders are almost always invited to the Capitol, and I would suspect they limited space this year. I want to say thank you both for spending your time with us. We know there are a lot of places you could be, and we really appreciate you being here to help educate the advocates about the relations with the nations and the state. What do you hope we will hear from the governor in the State of the State?
Well, I'm unmuted, so I guess I forgot I was unmuted. I'm never going to get used to this stuff. So last year, a year ago, I penned an editorial in the Tulsa World encouraging the governor to use this his state of the state to repair relationships between himself and the tribes. I think he has another opportunity today to do that as well, with a year of hindsight, with a year of pain, both self-inflicted and I think just, providence when it comes to the virus and what the state's gone through, to really look back and see how important relationships are between himself and really, it's unfortunately, it's not just tribal nations that he's had issue with relationships with. And so to use this to be a unifying message today, not a divisive message, for an opportunity to build bridges and create partnerships. And I desire that for him as a brother in Christ. I desire that for him as a leader of my state that I was born and raised in, as a partner in the legislative process that I served in, and as a government to government relationship that I have with him now as a leader of a sovereign nation. I desire that for him, and I think that I believe that there is an opportunity here to do that, and we'll see. I'm looking forward to watching it.
Well, that was well put, Chief, and I hope that he takes the opportunity to reach out to tribes in his speech. The tribes have been the best friend the state of Oklahoma has ever had, and that can continue to be the case and should continue to be the case. And I think that the governor can surely see the wisdom in finding common ground. And I mentioned a couple of areas that the Cherokee Nation and the governor's office had found common ground on, a couple of agreements, and that's something to build on. But I think more broadly, I hope there's an expression of the appreciation of what tribes have done for this state, not the least of which is the great and of immeasurable benefit cultural impact that the tribes have on the state. It makes Oklahoma one of the most unique and special places in the entire United States in a very positive way. And then when you think of all the economic impact, really billions of dollars in impact across the state, job creation, investing in infrastructure. I mean, we leaned in to help public education when the state was leaning the other way on funding. What we do on healthcare is of great impact when you think about the number of uninsured that we care for, and the quality of the healthcare and all the vitality that goes along with having quality healthcare in your state. We contribute mightily to that. So I think there's all the reasons in the world for him to embrace that. Here's the other thing. I mentioned education, but what we know from the past at least couple of decades is when the state retreats from certain areas of what ought to be, I think, priorities for the state, education, infrastructure, higher education, which took it on the chin even more than common education. You look at all these areas, and the tribes, again, have leaned in with funding and collaborating with schools to make them better, helping build roads, not just building bridges, but literally building bridges, doing things like putting water lines in places, little communities that the rest of the world forgot about, but in the name of economic development and other types of investments. If we're rowing in the same direction on those core areas that I mentioned, and there's others, then I think that also makes Oklahoma such a unique place. I mean, no other state in the country can say they've got 39 sovereign nations that are doing great things for their people and their communities. And then we have a state, if they're also doing great things for the people of the state of Oklahoma, Oklahoma ought to be head and shoulders above the rest. And I think that that's what we all want. So I think he's got an opportunity to strike that sort of tone.
Well, and I want to finish up by asking you both, basically for your wish list. And you touched on a lot of that just now with the speech, and what we'd like to see. But going forward, what can we do working together, advocacy organizations, individual advocates, the members of the nations, our state elected officials? What path can we take that is going to move us to the place where we all want to be, where we see better outcomes for all Oklahomans? I know that's a pie in the sky question about what can we do to fix things, but what would each of you see as the path of what we can do to make things better?
Well, we have to be in the room together. I think that that makes a huge difference, being able to be in a room with other leaders and to collaborate. I use that word because it's one of the most important words in my vocabulary. It's not the only word I know. It may sound like it today, but it's one of the most important words I know. And that's something that I learned through United for Oklahoma as a very young. I was elected at 29 as a very young tribal leader, to be able to be in the room with such long-standing, solid leaders of tribal nations, leaders in the state of Oklahoma, leaders in the country, really, to be able to learn from them and experience things from them. I think that's important, to have leaders from advocacy groups and the state of Oklahoma and our tribes and communities in the room together. And I think someone who's been really good at that has been Governor Matt Pinnell. I think he's been extremely good about getting people in rooms together to learn more about each other and learn about what's important to each other. And it's one thing that I know that we can all see eye to eye on. I think even with Governor Stitt, is that Oklahomans, we're here to serve Oklahomans. We all may see different ways in how we want to serve Oklahomans, or how we should serve Oklahomans, or how we want to meet the needs of Oklahomans. But we all ran for these offices. We're all elected to these offices because we want to serve Oklahomans or tribal citizens across the country. But we want to see a successful state. And so I think that the only way we can meet any of our desires, and I think we can all say that serving children and serving those that are most at risk, and our widows, our orphans, our strangers, if we want to do that, we have to collaborate and be in the room together and appreciate one another. And I think we have the opportunity today and moving forward in a new year to really reach those goals, but we have to do it together.
Well, in terms of some short-term specifics, some wish lists. First of all, OICA is a great asset to the state, and we look to this organization for guidance as we're developing our legislative agenda or things that we ought to care about. I mean, we look at what you all are focusing on. We have a couple of other pieces of legislation we're interested in. One, in the area of education, there's a bill that can help increase the efficiency and effectiveness of counting Native American students in public schools, which translates to dollars from the government of the United States and also from tribes sometimes. And it's just a better way for schools to operate. The issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people is still very important. There's a bill that's in the legislature this session, didn't pass last time, known as IDA's law. We'd like to see that pass. It'll give the state some more tools to work with us when someone is missing and it's a Native American, and we need to bring lots of resources and perhaps jurisdictions to bear. We're kind of building on what Chief Wood said, being together, being at the table is so important. When I think about how my time in office, which is relatively short, has gone, and the same with Chief Wood, is our interaction with the state, particularly the governor's office, has largely been in reaction to some problem. So the gaming compact was a problem of the governor's creation, but it was still a problem that commanded our attention. And of course, there was a great tension there. The issue of McGirt, the Supreme Court case from last summer that reaffirmed reservation status of the Creek Nation, and that, of course, extends to the other 4 of the 5 tribes and could be a principle that's applied to other tribes. We're reacting to that. I think it would be great for the tribes and state leaders to get off on a different footing. Instead of reacting to something that appears to be a problem, we probably need to do more sitting down and saying, these are some areas that we'd like to advance that are of mutual interest. Healthcare, by the way, we're interested in what's going on with Medicaid expansion. That affects the tribes too. Infrastructure, education. That would be better for the state of Oklahoma than for tribal leaders and the governor's office to be reacting to what they see as a problem or a crisis. Now, I think there's plenty of, I don't want to say plenty of blame to go around. There's plenty of opportunities that all the tribal leaders and the governor can share. So it doesn't have to be all on the governor. Perhaps we ought to step up a bit more as well for the sake of the state of Oklahoma.
Gentlemen, we cannot thank you enough, both of you, for, as I said, spending part of your day with us and for being a part of this and helping educate our advocates on what the role is of the advocacy work in trying to assist the sovereign nations and collaborating with the sovereign nations. Both of you are tremendous leaders. Both of the bills you mentioned, Chief Hoskin, are on our legislative agenda as priority bills. And I know there will be other opportunities coming up, and I can't thank you both enough. Justin, it was a pleasure to serve with you in the legislature. I want to tell a story about you. Chief Wood was elected Representative Wood right around the time that Sandy Hook happened. And I held a town hall in my district open to anybody to come and talk about those issues. And John Wood, a freshman in the other party, was the only lawmaker who showed up for that. And I knew right then and there you were going to be a friend and an ally and an advocate working on issues where even if we disagreed, we would have the opportunity to work together. And I have never forgotten that, and I appreciate you so much for that.
I love you, and I appreciate you and what you do for the state. And to serve 12 years in the legislature, I think I saw Speaker Hickman just jump on also. But to choose to serve that full 12 years in the legislature is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice in your pocketbook. It's a sacrifice in a lot of times your reputation. The willingness to do that to me has been an example for me going forward in my life. I decided not to run again after 2 terms because we just had our 3rd kid, and at that time, that sacrifice that you guys, that those that choose to serve those full 12 years make, that's incredible. And I'm so thankful that you've landed in a spot where you can still impact Oklahomans in such a great way. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here and really just spend some time with Chief Hoskin. I haven't got to see him in a while. So that to me has been a real joy. And Governor Haskin, I mean, this has been fun. I love this.
We couldn't have come up with a better way to do this, I don't think. And Chief Hoskin, equal accolades for you. It's been a great pleasure to work with you through the years. I had the opportunity to serve with your father in the legislature. And as much as I love you like a brother, I appreciate your spouse even more because she is one of my bosses and she allows me to keep my job. So please send my best to January.
I will put in a good word for you, and it's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. And Chief Wood, oh boy, it is good to be with you and see you again. And I admire your leadership, sir. Thank you.
And you both are welcome to stick around if you want. We're getting ready to kick off the State of the State here in a few minutes. They're doing organizational work right now. And I've asked some of my friends and colleagues from years past to come back and talk about what is going on right now and what's in the mind of legislators as we're getting ready to welcome the governor. They're going to go through some ceremonial things. We've got a slate of just, I cannot say enough good things about the leadership that's on this call right now, as far as those individuals who served us in the legislature and have continued to serve us in different roles. And I'm just going to go down the list as I've got them on here. Someone that we're all familiar with in the child advocacy realm, Dr. Laura Boyd, former state representative, I believe from House District 44 in the Norman area, is going to be on here talking, as well as, and you'll have to forgive me, Mr. President, Cal Hobson, former senator from the same general area of the state, I believe hailed from Lexington, Oklahoma during his time in the State House and the State Senate. And we also have another leader of one of the bodies. Cal represented the Senate as a presiding officer. We have current regent and former Speaker of the House, Jeff Hickman. Jeff, I believe was it Tacoma? And we also have someone who's already spoken to us, former Senator and OICA board member, AJ Griffin, who represented the Guthrie area. I want to thank all 4 of you for being on here to talk about this. I know Lacey is going to key up OETA once the festivities begin, and we'll have the volume turned down as much as we can on that. We want you all to talk basically to what's going on now with the first day of session and how we get started. And so I'm going to kick off with Laura first.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you. I think one of the things I really enjoyed about our last talk with Chief Wood and Chief Hoskin was the idea of putting Oklahoma first. All of us working together, whether it be tribal leaders, whether it be other Oklahomans, and that and sharing the blame with the governor for some of the difficulties, but not assigning it all there. And I am thinking particularly about Medicaid expansion right now. We did pass that as a state. It needs to be implemented. We last week, it awarded 4 private contracts to MCOs to privatize our system here, and particularly within that, as you all probably know, one contract went statewide for children's services. So, and the legislature and the governor are at odds about whether that should happen and how it should happen. So I think of all things we've been talking about, the themes, that's very high in my mind also right now, today, going forward. Are we going to collaborate to get this done on behalf of the people, on behalf of the children, on behalf of the voters who passed this, on behalf of the legislators, on behalf of the executive branch?
Senator Griffin.
Well, thanks, Joe, and Laura, Jeff. Guys, it's good to see you. Cal, it's good to see you guys. These are 3 giants in the political arena, and I'm very humbled to be part of this panel alongside these 3 outstanding Oklahomans, especially to follow the Chief Wood and Chief Hoskins, who do such amazing work. Justin and I used to run a lot of bills together, so I always like what he's working on. I used to help him. I want to talk a little bit about what the new members are going through today, because I very vividly remember as a new member the first state of the state. First of all, I think it has all become real. Today is when until this point, their egos have been beefed up. Everybody's given them a title. They haven't yet figured out that they call them representative or senator because they can't remember their name. But beginning today, that starts to unravel a little bit for our new members, and they'll be in awe as they sit on the floor and listen to the governor. They'll look for cues from the other members, so what they're supposed to do when they stand, when they clap, and then the real work begins. So then their education begins, and they realize how little they know. I know Jerry discussed that earlier in the presentation today. But the key is, and she reiterated, and I want to reiterate to advocates, now's the time you create those relationships with members. You see what's important to them. You identify privately those who are foe and those who are friend. And today begins the real work of governing. And we're lucky in Oklahoma that it's a time-limited effort. I always say Texas does just as many crazy and wild, wacky things that we do, but they only get to do them every other year. So they only run really crazy bills half as much as we do because they meet every other year. So don't be distracted as advocates by the noise, because most of the members, about 80% of them, are in the room to do what they believe is right for their constituents and for the future of the state of Oklahoma. So the other 20%, they're just there to make noise. And don't get distracted by those that are there to make noise. You're muted, Joe.
Just like Justin, it happens to all of us. Mr. President, Cal Hobson.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Senator Griffin, I appreciate your advice about the crazies and the ones that work so hard. I just came in from my Lexington farm I've been searching for Bigfoot because I need that $25,000. If you know, you really are going to award it. That on a more serious note. Hi, Mr. Speaker. Hi, my friend Laura, Senator, and so many others on here. My God, it's a lineup of movers and shakers from all over the state. Joe, congratulations on putting this together. Just briefly, I'll focus on the relationship between the governor and the legislature in this way. I heard people talking about 12 years in the legislature. I did 28. I was a slow learner and did 12 in the House and then 16 in the Senate. Served under or with Boren, Nye, Bellman, Walters, Keating, Henry, and Fallon. So quite a bunch. And then speakers, one of the best, my friend, Speaker Hickman. We didn't always agree, doesn't matter. He was honest, a day is long. So relationship between the legislature and the governor. Year one for Governor Stitt was a honeymoon. Anything he wanted, the subservient legislature said, here, you can have the power, you can appoint, you can remove, whatever you want. We're just so glad to see you. You're an outside whiz-bang billionaire or millionaire that's made a lot of money. We want to strengthen your hand because the voters said that's what they wanted. Well, as it turned out, I think the legislature came to the conclusion, oops, there's a reason that we're supposed to convene, and it's not just to sit here like a doorknob, it's to actually be involved in the process. So after the honeymoon in the first year, in year two, they either got a divorce or a formal separation. I'm not sure which, we'll find out. The legislature decided they'd override 10 of his vetoes by wide margins. I'd never seen anything like it, Joe. Not just the Democrats were voting to override him. Almost every Republican did also, unheard of in the history of the state of Oklahoma. So year three is about to start. We'll see if they make up, kiss up and all that. Or my guess is the legislature's got its legs again, is going to have some strong voices, especially about the most important thing the legislature and the governor does, and that is write a budget. I better stop there and see what my friend, the speaker, has to say.
And last but certainly not least, I saved this gentleman since he still holds a position of high regard and honor, serving as a regent. Had the opportunity to serve with and under Speaker Hickman during his time in office, and always considered Jeff a good friend. And I'll even point out that I misunderstood one of his issues one time, and lo and behold, a Democrat actually publicly apologized to a Republican for mistaking something. So it does happen in politics where across party lines, you can eat a little crow and apologize. And Jeff was gracious, and Jeff has always been a good friend and a great leader. So, Mr. Speaker. Did we lose it? Oh, Jeff, for some reason, your sound's not working. We may have to have you log off. I knew you were going to say wonderful things about me, and I think you're doing this intentionally.
Real great things too.
There we go. It's still a little fuzzy, but we can hear you.
I won't repeat all the great things I said about you, Joe. I'll just move on to the great things about Cal and AJ and Laura that I was getting ready to get to. No, thanks for inviting me and including me, and what an exciting panel. Hopefully there'll be more discussions like this because I think that's what's missing. Here you have two Republicans and two Democrats that are friends and have respect and high regard for each other. And as Senator Hobson said, it doesn't mean we have to always agree, but we all share the belief that we want what's best for Oklahoma. We may have different ideas about how to get there, and that doesn't mean that we can't break bread together. And I think that's what we've really lost as a country, unfortunately. And hopefully we're not losing that as a state. It happened more quickly in DC, and a lot of times we see states follow that, and hopefully we can reverse that. In fact, I've been doing some work in that area with a couple of different groups, but the Aspen Institute's Rodell Fellowship that former Congressman Mickey Edwards has been running for the past 15 years and just retired, as well as the Institute for Civil Discourse that was started in Arizona after the Gabby Giffords shooting, and just trying to work behind the scenes with legislators of both parties to say exactly what Senator Hobson just said. You know, we can disagree and we can still be friends, and we can still be civil and work together and find common ground. And I think that's what we're missing. And I think how you hit the nail on the head. We're going to find out very quickly what the relationship is to date between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Being a creature of the legislature, I shared the concern that I think all of us did on this call that served with the legislature giving up a significant amount of power to the executive branch. It wasn't a personality issue. You know, it wasn't that Kevin Stitt should or shouldn't have it. And some of that happened even under Governor Fallin as well, and other governors. But as you said, Cal, the legislature has a role to play, and they're the closest to the people. And there's a reason our system of government is set up the way that it is. And they indeed that first year did give a lot of authority and a lot of their power away to the governor's office. And it's hard to get that back once you give that away. I think we saw some of that. So Joe, you had kind of asked what's going on at the Capitol right now, and AJ mentioned it as well. There's kind of two different schools of thought. There's new members there that are just amazed with the beautiful building that we've been able to restore and all the pageantry that's happening. And they're looking at their watches because they were told that session starts at noon the first Monday in February, and the governor comes and gives the State of the State speech, and it's now well after noon, and there's no governor and there's no speech, and they're looking around wondering what's supposed to be happening. Where's the Senate? Why aren't they here? Where's the governor? As you mentioned, there's a lot of technical things that happen on both chambers as the Senate will get ready to come over to the House side, assemble in the House chamber, and then greet the governor as he arrives with much fanfare, and then we're off and running. So we'll see. I think you'll probably hear the governor talk a lot about the vaccine rollout. I saw some statistics today that our percentage actually is better than most in terms of getting the vaccine out around the state. So that's a positive. And usually governors like to talk about positive things if they can identify those, and you'll hear that. I've heard a lot of talk about the fact that we're going to have more money than we thought. I don't think that's true. I think that's a misstatement. I think the truth is the hole is not going to be as big as we thought. We're not going to have more money than we thought. We're going to have less of a hole, which is positive. But that's two different things. To say we're going to have more money than we thought to spend, than to say we're going to have to cut less than we thought. And I think that's where they're going to be this session with that. So we'll see how it all plays out. I think the governor has done a lot of work. He's basically replaced his entire staff. It's very close staff. He brought Brian Bingman back, who was the former pro tem of the Senate, to help him with his legislative problem that he had last session. New chief of staff who comes not from the Capitol at all. But the governor seems to be a little more receptive to including people that maybe had some experience in the building. It's important to have people, like it or not, that know where the buttons and switches are and how to get things done in the Capitol, and to come in, as we've seen in a lot of cases, not just the governor's office in Oklahoma, we saw it in the White House and other places, people that come in and say, well, we're going to do things completely different, and we don't need anybody that's been here. We want to bring outsiders in. That's great, except no one knows where the light switch is in the building if you have people that came from the outside. And so I think you're seeing now that shift back to having people that know how to get things done, how to work with the legislature, how to work with the agencies, the boards and commissions. And so it'll be very interesting to see if that works and how long that lasts, because it won't be long, as Senator Hobson mentioned, where there'll be a disagreement, and then we'll see how that's handled, because it's very easy for the two branches. And Joe, as we know, it's very easy for the two bodies, even the House and Senate, to get sideways. It seemed like the House and the governor were on the same page as first year, and the Senate was the odd person out. And this last year, it seemed like the House and Senate were married at the hip, and the governor was outside looking in. So we'll see who the third leg of the stool is this session, or if they all work together. But it won't take very many weeks before we know that.
You touched on a topic I was hoping would be brought up. It seems like every single session, there are, between the three aspects, the House, the Senate, and the governor, two of the three will pair up, and then the third one is oftentimes left fighting the good fight on the other side. And that happens a lot. And this first question I've got for you all, I want to go specifically to the two presiding officers. What, as presiding officers, you're having to not only navigate relations with the executive branch, also navigate relations with the chamber across the hall. What are the presiding officers doing right now? They've just appointed their committee chairmen, their leadership, those lieutenants, the whips, the floor leaders. What right now would be the likely scenario of what Greg Treat and Charles McCall are going through? Jeff, I know you're still on mute, or nope, you're still up on my screen. I'll let you go first.
Well, I think they're sizing up the new members, trying to figure out where they're going to fall on the political spectrum, would be my guess. And they're hoping they can keep their bluff in as long as they can. A lot of people don't realize the Speaker of the House or the Pro Tem of the Senate isn't in charge. They work for the members, and the members decide on any given day who the leader of the House or Senate is, and so hopefully they're hoping they can keep their bluff in, that they're there to kind of hand down the direction of the day. But my guess is they're really trying to size up the new members, and then also keeping an eye on those seasoned members to see where things have moved. We've had so many new members since I left. It's just so much different now than it was. You have so many people serving that haven't experienced the Capitol with any other leadership or any other leadership style than what you currently have, and they don't really know anything.